Hey there, tonight we're diving into how ancient Greeks deftly sidestepped Spartan aggression. What you're about to discover is the unexpected diplomacy that unfolded beyond the battlefield. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. So there you are, smack dab in the middle of the 5th century BCE, and life's a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, you've got the vibrant city-states of Greece buzzing with philosophical debates and theatrical performances. On the other hand, there's Sparta, the ancient equivalent of that grumpy neighbor who's always ready to pounce if your lawn oversteps its boundaries. These folks aren't just any warriors. They're the Spartans, ferocious, relentless, and with a reputation that could make even the bravest Athenians a little uneasy. Let's talk about Sparta's rise to fame. It's not like they woke up one day and decided, hey, let's be the toughest guys on the block. It took decades of disciplined training and a society so militarized that even their dogs probably knew how to march in formation. Around the 6th century BCE, Sparta started flexing its muscles, and by the time you're hanging out in the 5th century, they're a full-blown military powerhouse. They achieved this through a little something called the agoge system. Picture this. You're 7 years old, ripped from your family, and tossed into a rigorous training program that makes modern boot camps look like a day at the spa. You learn endurance, stealth, and how to endure pain without flinching. Crying's for Athenians, not Spartans. The Spartan way of life was all about the warrior ethos. They weren't just soldiers, they were living weapons. The famous saying went, come back with your shield, or on it. Translation, victory or death, no in-betweens. But hey, at least the pressure to do well on math tests was non-existent. The whole society was set up to support the military machine. The state provided for the soldiers, and their only job was to train and fight. But here's the catch. While they were busy being the ancient world's action heroes, someone else had to keep the economy ticking over. Enter the Helots. Now, the Helots were the indigenous people of Laconia and Messenia, basically the ones doing the grunt work so the Spartans could focus on their warrior pursuits. Think of them as the unsung heroes of the Spartan economy, though they probably wouldn't have appreciated the term hero, given their status as state-owned serfs. Helots outnumbered Spartans by a ratio of about 7-1, which is about as lopsided as a basketball game between the Harlem Globetrotters and your local high school team. This imbalance meant that Spartans had to be vigilant, always ready to quash any potential uprising. Spartan society was a bit like living in a house made of glass, impressive to look at, but you always had to worry about cracks. The Spartan facade of invincibility is where things get interesting. Sure, they were tough as nails, but the myth of the Spartan super soldier glosses over a few inconvenient truths. They relied heavily on Helots not just for agriculture, but also for support in warfare. During battles, the Helots often served as light infantry, a fact conveniently ignored in the glory tales. Sparta's economy was also far from robust. They shunned trade and luxury, which sounds noble until you realize it left them economically stunted compared to their more commercially savvy neighbors. And let's not forget the societal pressures. Spartan boys were raised in a world where failure wasn't an option, not because it was a motivational mantra, but because the consequences were brutally real. If Spartan society had a motto, it might have been, there is no try, only do or die. You had to be the best, the fastest, the strongest, or else face the shame of letting down your entire city-state. The agoge wasn't just about training warriors. It was about crafting a mindset that valued resilience and conformity above all else. But hey, who doesn't love a good myth? The allure of the Spartan warrior is hard to resist. They were the ultimate underdogs, the few against the many, the guys who could turn the tide of battle with sheer grit. In reality, though, they were just as bound by the limitations of their society as they were empowered by their training. The legendary Spartan shield was both a tool of war and a metaphor for their society, strong, protective, but ultimately reliant on the cohesion of every part to function properly. As we wrap up this ancient tale, remember that while the Spartans were indeed formidable, They weren't invincible. Their reputation was built on a mixture of genuine military prowess and carefully curated myth. It's a story that reminds us that legends often mask the gritty, complex realities of the past. So next time you hear someone say, "Be like a Spartan," maybe remind them that being a Spartan was about more than just muscles and battle cries. It was about navigating a world where survival meant more than just wielding a sword. It meant mastering the art of living in a society where every move was calculated, every action scrutinized, and every day a new challenge. So now we've painted a vivid picture of those Spartan warriors and their rigorous lifestyle. Quite the tale, isn't it? But let's not get too lost in admiration for the Spartan machine, because while they're busy perfecting the art of war, just a hop, skip, and a trireme ride away in Athens, a different kind of magic is happening. And by magic, I mean the kind of political maneuvering that would make even Machiavelli nod in approval. Welcome to Athens, the intellectual and cultural heart of Greece, where philosophy and art flourish like wildflowers on a spring day. But don't let the toga-clad thinkers fool you. Athens is no stranger to the rough and tumble world of geopolitics. In fact, they're masters at it. When Spartan aggression looms large, Athens doesn't just sit around debating the finer points of ethics. They roll up their sleeves and get to work on something that's as much about brains as it is about brawn. Alliances. Say hello to the Delian League. Now, if you thought the League of Nations was a 20th century innovation, think again. The Delian League was the original let's band together and not get steamrolled club. Formed around 478 BCE, this coalition was originally a defensive pact against the Persian Empire, still licking its wounds from the Greco-Persian Wars. But as time went on, it became clear that the League was less about Persian threats and more about counterbalancing Spartan power. Here's how it worked. Member states would chip in ships or money to a central treasury, originally kept on the island of Delos, hence the name. In theory, this was for mutual defense. In practice, it was Athens' ticket to maritime dominance. They had the largest navy, and that was no small feat in a world where naval power was like a 21st century nuclear arsenal. With triremes as numerous as modern-day commuters, Athens could project power across the Aegean Sea. We're talking about a fleet that could reach over 200 ships at its peak, each manned by around 200 rowers. That's a lot of manpower and a lot of political muscle, but let's not sugarcoat it. The Delian League was as much about Athenian control as it was about collective security. Athens had a knack for turning allies into allies. Let's just say that if you wanted out, you were likely to get a stern visit from the Athenian navy. It was less join us for freedom and more join us or else. This subtle coercion came with a price tag, mind you. The economic strain on member states was significant, as they had to cough up cash or resources to keep the League afloat. Athens, though, was a master of the fiscal game. By 454 BCE, they moved the League's treasury from Delos to Athens itself, like a kid taking the Monopoly bank to their side of the board. This shift wasn't just symbolic, it was a power move. With the treasury under Athenian control, they could fund grandiose building projects like the Parthenon and maintain their naval supremacy. And while this brought prosperity to Athens, it also created resentment. You could call it the ancient version of taxation without representation, and it didn't sit well with everyone. The costs didn't stop at finances. Socially, Athens was riding a wave of imperial overreach. Sure, they were the cultural and intellectual hub, but maintaining such a vast network of control meant that democracy, yes, the very thing they were famous for, had to be carefully balanced with the needs of empire. It's a bit like juggling flaming swords. One wrong move and you're toast. The tension between Athenian ideals and imperial realities was a delicate dance that would eventually lead to friction within the League. But let's not ignore the genius behind Athens' strategy. Their approach wasn't just about brute force. It was about influence, diplomacy, and yes, a healthy dose of cunning. You've got to admire the audacity. It takes a special kind of political acumen to convince your neighbors that your self-interest is also theirs. And while the Spartans had their helots, Athens had its silver mines in Laurium, which provided the wealth to keep the League's coffers full and the triremes afloat. You see, the Athenian navy was their ace in the hole, their secret weapon against Spartan land dominance. While Sparta's hoplites were busy stomping around on dry land, Athens was ruling the waves. This naval strength allowed them to supply far-flung allies, conduct raids on enemy shores, and most importantly, secure grain routes from the Black Sea, vital for feeding their burgeoning population. It was a strategic game of chess, and Athens was playing to win. But hold on, before you start thinking Athens was all sunshine and strategery. Remember, with great power comes great enemies. The very alliances that bolstered their strength also sowed seeds of discord. The more influence Athens wielded, the more they had to deal with the inevitable backlash from allies who felt more like vassals. If you think being a superpower is easy, just ask the Athenians. They were learning the hard way that empire building was a double-edged sword, one that could cut both ways if they weren't careful. As we leave Athens for now, keep in mind that their story is far from over. They've set the stage for a confrontation that will shake the Greek world to its core. But that, my friends, is a tale for another time. For now, let's just appreciate the political artistry of Athens, a city that turned diplomacy into a fine art and alliances into instruments of power. The Athenians may have lacked the brute force of Sparta, but they more than made up for it with their ability to navigate the choppy waters of ancient geopolitics. Now, while Athens was busy crafting diplomatic masterpieces and turning the Aegean into its personal playground, let's shift the spotlight to the dark clouds on the horizon, the Peloponnesian War. Grab your popcorn, because this 27-year saga makes Game of Thrones look like a friendly game of Risk. It all kicks off in 431 BCE, when tensions between Athens and Sparta reached a boiling point. Picture two heavyweight boxers circling each other in the ring, each waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sparta, land of the hoplites, was itching to knock Athens down a peg or two, tired of their maritime shenanigans and growing influence over the Greek world. Meanwhile, Athens, with its sprawling Delian League, wasn't exactly in the mood to yield its hard-earned supremacy. Now, the strategies employed by both sides were as different as night and day. Sparta, true to its nature, relied on its formidable land forces. Their hoplites were the ancient equivalent of a juggernaut, plodding across enemy territories like a well-oiled machine. The plan: march into Athenian territory, burn their crops, and wait for Athens to come out and fight. Easy peasy, right? Well, not quite. You see, Athens wasn't about to play Sparta's game. Under the guidance of the astute Pericles, the Athenians employed a strategy that was as clever as it was infuriating to the Spartans. Instead of meeting them head-on, Pericles ordered the populace to retreat behind the city's long walls. These walls stretched a good 4 miles from Athens to its port at Piraeus, effectively turning the city into an island fortress. The Spartan army could stomp around Attica all it wanted, but as long as the Athenian fleet controlled the sea, they remained well-stocked and unbothered. The strategy relied on patience and endurance, banking on the idea that Sparta couldn't keep up the siege indefinitely, and for a while it worked. Sparta was left twiddling its thumbs, unable to breach the walls or force a decisive battle. But then, like a cruel twist of fate, the guards, or germs more specifically, had other plans. Enter the plague of Athens, circa 430 BCE. This wasn't just a case of the sniffles. It was a full-blown epidemic that swept through the city like a wildfire in a hayloft, killing an estimated 1/3 of Athens' population, including the mastermind Pericles himself. Not exactly the morale booster you'd want during wartime. With Pericles gone and a chunk of their workforce decimated, Athens was left reeling. But if you thought they'd throw in the towel, you'd be mistaken. Instead, they doubled down on their naval tactics, launching daring raids along the Peloponnesian coast and keeping their supply lines open. It was a testament to their resilience, like watching a boxer take hit after hit, but refusing to stay down. Over on Team Sparta, the mood was equally tense. They tried to counter Athens' naval dominance by building their own fleet, funded by none other than their old enemy, Persia. Yes, the Persians were all too happy to fan the flames of Greek discord, thinking, if we can't beat you, we'll let you beat each other. This uneasy alliance was a bitter pill for the Spartans, but desperate times called for desperate measures. And speaking of desperate measures, let's talk about the Sicilian expedition, a colossal blunder that would make any military strategist cringe. In 415 BCE, Athens decided it was a brilliant idea to send a massive fleet to Sicily to aid their ally, Segesta, against Syracuse. The fleet consisted of over 130 triremes and around 5,000 infantry. practically half of Athens' military might. Why? Because they saw Sicily as the key to cutting off Sparta's grain supply and expanding their influence even further. Ambitious, absolutely. Foolhardy, you bet. The expedition was doomed from the start. For one, it was plagued by political infighting. Alcibiades, the flamboyant and controversial Athenian general, was one of its chief architects. However, just as the fleet set sail, Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege. Rather than face the music, he defected to, wait for it, Sparta. Talk about a plot twist. This left the remaining commanders, Nicias and Lamachus, in a tough spot, lacking the charisma and cunning that Alcibiades brought to the table. Once in Sicily, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The Athenians underestimated the strength and resolve of Syracuse, which was not only well defended, but also quickly reinforced by, you guessed it, the Spartans. What followed was a drawn-out siege that drained Athenian resources and morale. In 413 BCE, the final blow came when the Athenian fleet was destroyed in the great harbor of Syracuse, leaving their soldiers stranded. The ensuing massacre and capture were catastrophic, marking the beginning of the end for Athenian dominance. Meanwhile, Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, was busy playing both sides like a seasoned poker player. After helping Sparta, he fell out of favor and fled to Persia, where he advised the Persians on how to string both Athens and Sparta along for maximum chaos. Eventually, he returned to Athens, where his charisma and promises of Persian support briefly restored him to power. But as history would have it, his luck ran out, and he was eventually forced into exile once more. With the Sicilian expedition in ruins and their resources stretched thin, Athens faced mounting pressure from all sides. Sparta, now bolstered by Persian gold, finally managed to build a fleet that could challenge Athenian supremacy at sea. In 405 BCE, at the Battle of Aegispotami, the Spartan navy, led by Lysander, delivered the coup de grace to the Athenian fleet, capturing almost all their ships and effectively cutting off their grain supply. This defeat was a death knell for Athens. By 404 BCE, after a protracted siege, Athens was forced to surrender. This marked the end of the war and the beginning of a fragile peace that left Greece in a state of disarray. Sparta imposed its oligarchic rule over Athens, dismantling the long walls and bringing an end to Athenian democracy, at least for a while. But hold up, don't start rolling the credits just yet. This so-called Spartan victory wasn't the neat and tidy conclusion they'd hoped for. The war left a lasting scar on the Greek world, exposing the vulnerabilities and excesses of even the mightiest city-states. It was a rude awakening that power could shift as easily as the tides, leaving both victors and vanquished to grapple with the aftermath. The Peloponnesian War was more than just a conflict. It was a cautionary tale of hubris, ambition, and the delicate balance of power. As the dust settled, Greece was left fractured and weakened, paving the way for new players to enter the scene. But that's a drama for another day. For now, let's reflect on the sobering lesson that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not just with swords and shields, but with strategy, resilience, and a fair share of audacity. The Peloponnesian War, a marathon of mayhem and might that left Greece like a rock band after a wild tour, exhausted, a bit disheveled, and wondering what on earth just happened. The Spartans, those famed warriors of the motherland, strutted off with a victory that was as much a Pyrrhic triumph as an Olympic gold medal in procrastination. Because here's the kicker, managing an empire is a whole different beast than winning a war. Welcome to the aftermath, where Sparta was thrust onto the throne of Greek dominance, only to find the seat a bit too hot for comfort. You see, ruling an unruly bunch of city-states wasn't like herding sheep. It was more like herding cats with a penchant for philosophy and rebellion. The Spartans, with their strict military ethos and disdain for luxury, went exactly the life of the party. Their rigid society, once celebrated for its discipline, was now a straitjacket in an era that demanded flexibility and innovation. Sparta's hegemony, or should I say, their moment in the Greek sun, was about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Economically, they were out of their depth. Their currency, iron bars. Yes, you heard that right. While Athens was dealing in silver coins, Sparta was trading in something that could double as a doorstop. This aversion to monetary sophistication left them economically stunted, unable to capitalize on their newfound power. Politically, they were the party crashers nobody wanted to invite. They imposed oligarchies, a fancy term for rule by a few in conquered territories, which didn't sit well with their new subjects. Imagine being promised freedom and getting a curfew instead. The resentment was palpable, and the cracks in the Spartan facade began to show. Enter Thebes, the underdog city-state that decided it was time to give Sparta a taste of its own medicine. Now, Thebes wasn't exactly the poster child of Greek powerhouses, but it had a secret weapon. Epaminondas, a general whose name might be a mouthful, but whose strategies were masterstrokes. He redefined the art of war with tactics as revolutionary as a smartphone in a world of rotary phones. The stage was set for a showdown at Leuctra in 371 BCE. Picture this: the Thebans, outnumbered and outgunned, facing the seemingly invincible Spartan hoplites. But here's the plot twist. Epaminondas had a trick up his sleeve. He deployed an innovative tactic called the oblique order, stacking his forces deep on the left flank. This wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a chess move that would make grandmasters weep with envy. When the battle commenced, the Theban left punched through the Spartan right with the precision of a scalpel. The Spartan phalanx, usually a wall of shields and spears that could bulldoze anything in its path, crumbled like a sandcastle in the tide. The result, a staggering Theban victory, with the Spartan king Cleombrotus among the casualties. It was a wake-up call that rang across Greece like a gong, signaling the decline of Spartan supremacy. The triumph at Leuctra wasn't just a military win, it was a seismic shift in Greek geopolitics. Thebes, once a mere footnote in the annals of history, became the leading power in Greece, if only for a brief, shining moment. They even managed to liberate the Helots in Messenia, sending Sparta's social structure into a tailspin. It was as if the very foundations of Spartan society had been yanked out from under them, leaving them scrambling for balance. Amidst this upheaval, Greek city-states found themselves in a new world order, or more accurately, disorder. The balance of power was more like a seesaw in a gale, constantly shifting and never stable. Economically, the region was a patchwork of prosperity and poverty. While some city-states flourished through trade and innovation, others, like Sparta, struggled with outdated practices and internal strife. Socially, the war had left its mark. The rigid hierarchies that once defined Greek society were being questioned. The idea that birth dictated one's destiny was slowly being eroded by the realization that competence and innovation mattered more. Change was in the air, and it smelled a lot like opportunity for those willing to embrace it. But let's not pretend these changes were smooth sailing. The Greeks were learning the hard way that power was as much a curse as a blessing. The lessons of the Peloponnesian War, hubris, ambition, the costs of empire, were fresh in their minds, yet the allure of dominance remained as tempting as ever. It was a classic case of those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. As the curtain fell on Sparta's reign, the stage was set for new players to emerge, looking to carve their own legacies in the ever-shifting sands of Greek politics. Yet, in this tumultuous landscape, the Greeks were about to face challenges that would make even the most seasoned strategists pause. But that's a story we'll unravel next time, my fellow history buffs. For now, let's savor the irony. The Spartan warriors, who once seemed invincible, were undone not by brute force, but by the winds of change and the cleverness of their foes. It's a reminder that in the grand play of history, the mighty often fall, not with a bang, but with the whisper of a better idea. And so, as the curtain closes on Sparta's short-lived supremacy, we find ourselves standing at the precipice of yet another seismic shift in the ancient world. Enter stage left, Macedonia. Now, if you're picturing Macedonia as a sleepy little kingdom on the fringes of Greek civilization, you're half right. For a long time, they were the underdogs, the overlooked cousins at the Greek family reunion. But under the savvy leadership of Philip Roman II, they transformed from a backwater kingdom into a formidable power player, equipped with an army that would make even the most seasoned Spartan hoplite raise an eyebrow. Philip Roman II, a king with more cunning than a fox in a henhouse, revolutionized military tactics with his introduction of the Macedonian phalanx. Picture this: soldiers wielding sarissas, 18-foot-long pikes, advancing like a human porcupine. This was less about bravery and more about tactical brilliance. The Macedonian phalanx was a steamroller in a world full of scooters. and it rolled over Greece like a hot knife through butter. By 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip had effectively put Greece under Macedonian sway, but not before showing the Greeks how obsolete their once revered military tactics had become. The irony. As Sparta had once humbled Athens, Macedonia now did the same to Sparta and her peers. It was a classic case of the student surpassing the master, and it set the stage for a new chapter in ancient history. Enter Alexander the Great, Philip's son, who took the Macedonian enterprise and turned it into a sprawling empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt and all the way to the Indus River. Talk about ambition. Alexander wasn't just content to rule, he wanted to conquer the world, and he nearly did. His campaigns, which began in 334 BCE, were less about territorial expansion and more about cultural exchange, spreading Hellenistic ideals across 3 continents. But here's the kicker. Alexander's conquests were as much about legacy as they were about land. He absorbed and disseminated Greek culture, a move that would ripple through time. His cities, over 70 of them, often bore his name, Alexandria, and became centers of learning and cultural fusion. The most famous, in Egypt, housed the legendary Library of Alexandria, a beacon of knowledge that would influence generations to come. His empire, though short-lived, set the groundwork for the Hellenistic period, a time when Greek culture became the lingua franca of the ancient world. Yet, as grand as Alexander's story is, it also serves as a reminder of the impermanence of power. After his death in 323 BCE, his empire fractured like a Greek vase in a bull sharp. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up the empire like a Thanksgiving turkey, each taking a piece for themselves. The wars that followed were a testament to the chaos that often follows the fall of great powers. Now, let's not brush past the enduring allure of the Spartan and Athenian legacies, which continue to captivate our modern imaginations. Sparta, with its legendary warrior ethos, has become the poster child for discipline and resilience, the kind of place where pain is weakness leaving the body could have been a daily affirmation. But the myth of Spartan invincibility glosses over their dependency on the Helots and their eventual downfall. They were warriors, yes, but they were also slaves to their own rigid system, a poignant reminder that inflexibility can be a fatal flaw. Athens, on the other hand, is often romanticized as the cradle of democracy, art, and philosophy. But let's not forget the darker shades of this legacy, the imperial overreach, the social inequalities, and the eventual collapse of their golden age. Despite these blemishes, the Athenian experiment with democracy laid the foundation for modern political thought. Figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle left philosophical legacies that still provoke thought and debate today. These narratives of Spartan austerity and Athenian enlightenment have been retold countless times, each iteration adding a layer of myth to the reality. They shape our modern perceptions of what it means to be strong, to be democratic, and to be culturally vibrant. We see it in everything from military training programs to political discourse, and even in pop culture, where Spartan warriors and Athenian statesmen are celebrated as archetypes of heroism and intellect. In a world obsessed with the dichotomy of might versus mind, the stories of these ancient city-states offer a timeless lesson, that true strength lies not in domination, but in the ability to adapt, innovate, and inspire. For all their flaws and failures, the Greeks gave us something invaluable, the idea that human potential is boundless, a narrative that remains as compelling today as it was in the amphitheaters of Athens or the training grounds of Sparta. So what are we to make of these ancient tales? Perhaps it's that history, much like the myths it spawns, is a living tapestry of lessons learned and forgotten, of realities faced and imagined. In the end, the Greek city-states, with all their brilliance and blunders, left behind a legacy that continues to resonate, a testament to human ambition and the eternal quest for greatness. And there you have it, from Spartan warriors to Athenian thinkers and the Macedonian conquests that followed. These ancient narratives remind us that even the greatest powers can rise and fall. But in their wake, they leave ideas and stories that endure, shaping our world long after the last phalanx has marched and the final chorus has sung. So, the next time you watch a movie, read a book, or even play a video game that echoes these ancient tales, remember, You're tapping into a legacy that's thousands of years old, a testament to the enduring power of stories to captivate, educate, and inspire. And who knows, maybe somewhere in the annals of future history, people will look back at our time and marvel at the myths we leave behind. Until then, let's keep the dialogue going, because if there's one thing the Greeks taught us, it's that the conversation is never truly over. In the land of ancient Egypt, where the River Nile was the internet of its day, connecting people, providing sustenance, and occasionally flooding your basement, there existed a pantheon of gods that were less divine beings and more like the cast of a reality TV show. These celestial entities often behaved like they'd been binge-watching too much of their own drama. Let's dive into this cosmic soap opera, where the stakes were as high as the pyramids and the family feuds were eternal. First up in this divine circus is Ra, the sun god, who was basically the CEO of the universe. Think of him as the original influencer, rising every morning to traverse the sky in his solar bark, a celestial boat ride that even Disneyland can't compete with. Ra was the big cheese, the top banana, the ultimate, I've got 99 problems but the sun ain't one, kind of god. He was said to be born anew each day, and his nightly journey through the underworld was a little like your commute home, except with more demons and fewer traffic lights. Now, Ra didn't run this cosmic show alone. He had a crew, and oh, what a crew it was. You had Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who was basically the ancient Egyptian version of a retirement planner. Osiris was the guy you wanted to know if you were planning on dying, which, spoiler alert, was everyone. His wife, Isis, was the goddess of health, marriage, and wisdom, essentially the Pinterest board of goddesses. Together, they were the power couple of the afterlife, until Osiris got the ultimate ghosting experience courtesy of his brother Seth. Seth, the god of chaos, storms, and deserts, was the poster child for sibling rivalry gone wrong. In a plot twist worthy of a daytime soap, Seth killed Osiris, chopped him into pieces, and scattered him across Egypt. Isis, demonstrating the kind of determination usually reserved for assembling IKEA furniture, managed to find and reassemble Osiris, making him the first mummy and a part-time ruler of the underworld. Seth, meanwhile, was left to sulk in the desert, embodying every bad-tempered weather event Egypt had to endure. Then there's Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky, who was the son of Isis and Osiris. He spent much of his time avenging his father's death and battling Seth for the throne. Horus's story is like that of a royal family feud, but with more animal heads and magical eye transplants. In fact, Horus lost one of his eyes in a scuffle with Seth, which was later restored, becoming the famous Eye of Horus, a symbol of protection, sacrifice, and really bad family reunions. Alongside these headliners, there were other gods in this chaotic pantheon, like Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, and the afterlife's bouncer, who ensured only the worthy got through the pearly gates. And let's not forget Bastet, the cat-headed goddess of home, fertility, and everything feline. Yes, she basically invented the internet's obsession with cats long before YouTube was a thing. Now, you might be wondering how these gods came into existence. Well, the Egyptians had a creation myth that was as convoluted as it was fascinating. According to one version, everything began with Nun, the watery abyss. Out of Nun emerged Atum, a self-created deity who, through some divine sleight of hand, produced the first couple, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Together they gave birth to Nut, the sky goddess, and Jeb, the earth god, whose relationship was the ultimate long-distance love story, always touching but never meeting. And what about Maat, you ask? She was the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, the ultimate referee of divine antics. Maat was like the universal rulebook, ensuring the stars stayed in their courses, and that the Nile behaved itself most of the time. Her concept was so fundamental that even the pharaohs had to uphold it, or risk the wrath of a very grumpy populace. Speaking of pharaohs, these rulers were not just political leaders, but also considered semi-divine, the human middlemen between the gods and the people. Imagine being a pharaoh and getting a divine to-do list every day. Talk about pressure. They were expected to keep Maat in balance, build massive monuments, and occasionally smite enemies, all while wearing a snazzy headdress. The pharaoh's job was like juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle on a tightrope, except the tightrope was the balance of the universe. They led rituals, built temples, and were responsible for ensuring the guards were happy, because an unhappy guard could mean anything from a bad harvest to the Nile drying up, and nobody wanted to be that guy. In this world, the guards were as capricious as the desert winds, and the pharaohs had to navigate this divine minefield with diplomacy and grandeur. It was a world where the line between myth and reality was as thin as papyrus, where divine intervention was as common as a sandstorm, and where the guards' antics were as unpredictable as a Nile flood. So, as the sun sets over this ancient landscape, remember that the guards of Egypt weren't just figures of stone and hieroglyphs. They were the stars of a cosmic drama that played out against the vast backdrop of the desert. And like all good dramas, it was full of twists, turns, and just the right amount of smiting. While our ancient Egyptian saga sets the stage for divine drama, let's now dive into the earthly theatrics that were the rituals and daily grind of temple life. Buckle up, because this isn't your average Sunday service. Forget wholesome choir robes and potluck dinners. We're talking about a religious practice that took extra to a whole new level. For starters, mummification wasn't just about wrapping up Granny in linen and hoping for the best. Nope, this was a methodical, grueling process that would make even the most seasoned medical examiner wince. Let's start with the basics. Mummification was essentially an 11-step program to eternal life, minus the motivational posters. It began with the removal of the brain through the nostrils. Yes, you heard that right, through the nostrils. If that sounds like a party trick gone wrong, that's because it was. The Egyptians believed the brain was about as useful as a chocolate teapot, so it got the boot early in the embalming process. Next up, internal organs were carefully extracted and stored in canopic jars. These jars were guarded by guards with names that sound like they were plucked from a fantasy novel. Duamuref, Happy, Imseti, and Kebe-Senu. Interestingly, the heart was left in place, considered the seat of intelligence and emotion. Take that, modern science. Now, if you're thinking this sounds expensive, you'd be right. Mummification was a luxury only the elite could afford, with costs comparable to a modern-day luxury car. The rest of the body was then dehydrated using natron, a naturally occurring salt that might as well have been the ancient Egyptian version of Miracle Grow for corpses. After 40 days of drying out like a forgotten Thanksgiving turkey, the body was wrapped in multiple layers of linen, with amulets and charms tucked in for good measure. In the end, Mummy was ready for its red carpet event, or rather, its elaborate tomb. Speaking of tombs, let's not forget the architecture of these eternal homes. The pharaohs, always the overachievers, built pyramids that doubled as monuments to their godly status and eternal resting places. And these weren't just any old tombs. They were meticulously engineered masterpieces built with millions of limestone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons each. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, was originally 481 feet tall. Take that, Empire State Building. It's estimated that constructing just one of these colossal structures took around 20 years and the labor of thousands of workers, not slaves as often depicted. These workers were well-fed and well-housed, given bread, beer, and a cozy place to sleep. Their employers knew that a happy worker was a productive worker, even if the ultimate goal was a giant stone triangle. Now, when it comes to temple life, these were not the serene houses of worship we're familiar with today. Egyptian temples were bustling centers of economic and religious activity. They owned land, managed agricultural production, and were often the largest employers in the region. Priests acted more like property managers than spiritual counselors, overseeing the temple estates and ensuring the guards received their daily offerings. Think bread, beer, and livestock. You could say the guards had quite the appetite. The daily temple rituals were precise and unyielding, a lot like your favorite aunt's Thanksgiving dinner plans. Priests would perform rituals to wake the guards each morning, involving washing and dressing the guard's statue, which was believed to house the deity itself. This was followed by a procession of offerings, a choreographed event that involved incense, music, and a whole lot of pomp. The Egyptians took the phrase, "The show must go on," to heart, ensuring these rituals were performed with military precision to maintain the cosmic order. After all, a missed ritual could mean cosmic chaos, a bad day for everyone involved. But let's not romanticize this too much. The strict hierarchy within the temple often meant that lower-ranking priests were stuck with the less glamorous tasks, like cleaning up after the sacred animals or preparing the endless stream of food offerings. It was a far cry from the spiritual enlightenment you might expect, but an essential cog in the wheel of divine maintenance. And let's talk about those sacred animals. Cats, crocodiles, and even dung beetles enjoyed divine status, each associated with a particular deity. The sacred Apis bull, for instance, was worshipped in Memphis and treated like bovine royalty, complete with elaborate burial ceremonies when it passed away. Imagine being revered as a living god, only to end up as a prime cut offering in your afterlife. Talk about a career change. These practices weren't just about religious devotion. They were a crucial means of economic control and societal stability. The temples served as centers of wealth and political power. Pharaohs often used them to legitimize their rule, as aligning oneself with the gods was the ultimate PR strategy. And who could argue with that? After all, in a world where the Nile could flood your fields or your fortunes at a moment's notice, keeping the gods on your side was just good politics. So, when we look at the rituals and daily life of ancient Egyptian religion, it's clear that they were as much about maintaining social order and economic stability as they were about spiritual enlightenment. This blend of devotion and pragmatism is what kept the wheels of Egyptian society turning for over 3,000 years. And while we might marvel at the grandeur and mystery of it all, it's important to remember that behind every great pyramid and every gilded sarcophagus was a society working tirelessly to keep chaos at bay, one embalming session at a time. As we wrap up this chapter of Egyptian religious life, remember that the ancient Egyptians were nothing if not committed to their beliefs, however bizarre they may seem to modern sensibilities. From the painstaking mummification process to the daily rituals that kept the gods and the economy humming, their religious practices were a testament to a civilization that thrived on order and devotion. And as we continue to peel back the layers of this ancient world, more surprises await us in the sands of time. Stay tuned, because the pharaohs and their guards have plenty more stories to tell. But wait, there's more. As we unravel the ties between Egyptian religion and its economy, it's clear that temples in ancient Egypt were more than just spiritual sanctuaries. They were the Wall Street of their day, bustling with economic activity. Forget about the quiet, meditative spaces you might envision. These temples were more like high-powered corporations, complete with their own land holdings, staff, and even financial transactions. The temples owned vast tracts of land, which were farmed by laborers who were, surprisingly, more like tenants than slaves. In return for their hard work, these farmers would pay a kind of divine rent, ensuring the guards and the priests had their fill of grain, livestock, and other goodies. Think of temples as the ancient equivalent of Amazon, vast, sprawling operations that dominated their economic landscape. By the New Kingdom period, temples owned up to 30% of Egypt's arable land. The Temple of Ammon at Karnak was a powerhouse, employing thousands and running an operation that would make modern CEOs drool. It had its own workshops, granaries, and breweries. Yes, the guards were apparently big fans of a good brew, which might explain why they were so keen on keeping the Nile's waters flowing. After all, you can't make beer without water. The temple economy was like an intricate clock, each cog and wheel perfectly synchronized to keep the divine machine running. Priests, who were more like business managers, oversaw the day-to-day operations, ensuring that the guards' demands were met and that the temple's coffers remained full. These guys were the original multitaskers, blending spiritual duties with economic acumen. The stakes were high. Failure to appease the guards could result in poor harvests, floods, or, worst of all, public dissatisfaction. And in a society where the pharaoh was seen as a guard king, keeping the divine order intact was as crucial as keeping the Nile's waters on schedule. Now, let's dive into the scribes, those unsung heroes of ancient Egypt who chronicled it all. Imagine being a scribe back then, part historian, part accountant, and part novelist. These guys were the ultimate record keepers, writing down everything from tax records to epic tales of gods and pharaohs. Think of them as the Wikipedians of their time, but with considerably more papyrus and less digital drama. Their work required a mastery of hieroglyphs, which, let's be honest, makes modern shorthand look like child's play. Scribes were among the most educated members of society, holding a status that was both respected and envied. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, the ones who ensured that the stories and accounts of ancient Egypt didn't vanish like a sandstorm in the desert. And let's not forget their penchant for embellishment. After all, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? In their hands, a simple tax ledger could become a sweeping narrative of prosperity or divine favor, depending on who was reading it. The education of a scribe was no small feat. Boys, often from noble families, would begin their training at the age of 7, spending years learning to read and write the complex Egyptian script. By the time they finished, they could produce not only official documents, but also literature that rivaled the best of ancient storytelling. They were the ancient world's equivalent of an MFA program, but with a lot less student debt and a lot more emphasis on pleasing the gods. One famous scribe named Amenhotep, son of Hapu, became so revered that he was later deified. Talk about a promotion. His hard work and dedication to documenting the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III earned him a place in the Egyptian pantheon, a testament to the power and prestige scribes could achieve. But not all scribes were destined for divinity. Many toiled in relative obscurity, their work vital yet often unrecognized, a bit like the roadies of ancient Egypt, ensuring the show went on without a hitch. Let's not forget the role these scribes played in keeping the wheels of the temple economy greased. They meticulously recorded transactions, land ownership, and temple donations. Their records were the backbone of the temple's economic might, ensuring that the guards and the priests got their due. Without scribes, the temples would have been as chaotic as a sandstorm, unable to maintain the order necessary for their spiritual and economic functions. But what about the myths? Oh, the Egyptians loved a good myth as much as the next civilization. The stories they spun about their gods weren't just entertaining. They were a way to explain the mysteries of the world and enforce the social order. The myths served as a kind of divine propaganda, reinforcing the idea that the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of the gods, an essential belief for maintaining the pharaoh's authority. Take the story of the sun god Ra's daily journey across the sky. It wasn't just a celestial commute. It was a reminder of the pharaoh's power and the order he maintained. The myth of Osiris, Isis, and Horus wasn't just a tale of family drama. It was a narrative that legitimized the pharaoh's rule, portraying him as the successor to these divine figures. In a world where the line between myth and reality was as thin as a desert breeze, these stories provided a framework for understanding the world and one's place in it. And let's not overlook the economic implications of these myths. The grand temples built in honor of these stories weren't just religious centers. They were tourist attractions, drawing visitors and pilgrims who brought offerings and trade. The myths fueled an economy that relied on the constant flow of goods, services, and people. In this way, the stories of gods and heroes became a vital part of the economic engine that drove ancient Egyptian society. As we peer through the sands of time, it's clear that the religious and economic life of ancient Egypt were as intertwined as the strands of a papyrus scroll. The temples were the heart of this complex system, pumping life into a civilization that thrived on the balance of order and chaos. From the bustling temple economies to the scribes who recorded it all, every aspect of Egyptian life was a testament to their devotion and ingenuity. And as we continue to explore the mysteries of this ancient world, we find that the stories of gods and pharaohs are just the beginning. The real tale lies in the everyday lives of those who lived it, a story that is far from over. Stay tuned, because ancient Egypt still holds many secrets yet to be uncovered. And as we dive deeper into the sands of time, let's take a beat to unmask some of the more tantalizing myths that Hollywood and your high school history textbook have spun about ancient Egypt like a gleeful spider on a caffeine high. First up in our myth-busting extravaganza is the infamous Curse of the Pharaohs. You know the one. It's the Godaplot device, where anyone who dares disturb the eternal slumber of a mummy is doomed to suffer a fate worse than a Wi-Fi outage during a Netflix binge. The legend really took off after the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, when several members of the excavation team met untimely ends. Cue the dramatic music and spooky lighting. But let's put on our skeptics' hats for a moment. The notion of a curse is more Hollywood shtick than historical fact. Howard Carter, the guy who actually opened the tomb, lived a ripe old age, dying of natural causes in 1939. Not exactly the stuff of horror flicks. Most of the cursed deaths can be attributed to good old-fashioned bacteria or pre-existing health conditions. Turns out, ancient tombs weren't exactly sterile environments, and a cocktail of mold spores and bacteria can do a number on your immune system faster than you can say. Pass the hand sanitizer. And while we're debunking, let's chat about the seductive yet misleading tales surrounding Cleopatra Roman 7, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Hollywood loves to paint her as the queen of seduction, all smoky eyeliner and strategic ass bites. But Cleopatra was more than just a pretty face. She was a shrewd political operator who spoke at least 9 languages and was the first of her dynasty to actually learn Egyptian. She positioned herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, leveraging religious imagery to solidify her rule and curry favor with her subjects. Cleopatra was the ancient world's master of branding. Her image was as carefully curated as a modern Instagram influencer's feed. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were less about romance and more about realpolitik. These alliances were strategic moves to safeguard her throne and Egypt's independence. And let's not forget her economic acumen. Cleopatra's Egypt was a major grain supplier to Rome, making her an essential figure in the Mediterranean's power dynamics. She wasn't just playing the game, she was rewriting the rules. Now, let's pivot back to our favorite architectural marvels, the pyramids. Hollywood often shows these as massive slave-built structures, but that's another myth we need to toss into the Nile. Evidence suggests that the laborers were actually paid workers, likely conscripted farmers during the Nile's flood season when they couldn't work their fields, lived in nearby workers' villages, complete with medical care, food rations, and housing, perks that sound suspiciously like ancient employee benefits. And while they didn't have a 401k plan, they did have the satisfaction of knowing their hard work would stand for millennia. Forget a gold watch. These guys got a legacy. The pyramids were a testament to the Egyptians' engineering prowess, with the Great Pyramid of Giza consisting of about 3 million blocks, each weighing an average of 5 tons. That's some serious heavy lifting. Modern estimates suggest it took around 20 years to complete one pyramid, with a workforce that could have ranged from 20,000 to 30,000 people at peak times. These were not the back-breaking endeavors of a slave class, but the organized labor of a society that understood the importance of divine architecture in maintaining cosmic order. The pyramids were built as much for the gods as for the pharaohs, a celestial insurance policy against chaos. And speaking of divine, let's go back to the gods for a moment. Ancient Egyptian religion wasn't just a quaint collection of myths. It was a sophisticated system that underpinned every aspect of daily life. The gods were everywhere, from the kitchen to the battlefield, each with their quirks and responsibilities. Anubis, for instance, wasn't just the spooky, jackal-headed guy lurking in the afterlife. He was the ultimate funeral director, overseeing embalming and protecting graves. Bastet, the cat goddess, wasn't just a meme before memes were a thing. She symbolized home and domesticity, reflecting the Egyptians' deep appreciation for cats' pest control prowess. And then there's the whole concept of the afterlife, which wasn't just a dreary procession of harp-playing angels. The Egyptians envisioned a paradise called the Field of Reeds, where the afterlife mirrored the best parts of earthly existence. To get there, you had to pass the weighing of the heart ceremony, where your heart was weighed against Maat's feather of truth. It's like a cosmic job interview, with Anubis playing HR, Thoth keeping records, and Osiris making the final call. If your heart was lighter than the feather, congratulations, you got the eternal gig. If not, well, Amit, the devourer of the dead, was ready to offer a severance package of obliteration. So there you have it, folks, the myths and realities of ancient Egyptian religion and society, unwrapped like a mummy fresh from the tomb. As much as we love a good yarn, the truth is often stranger and more fascinating than fiction. The Egyptians were masters of blending the mystical with the mundane, creating a civilization that was as much about economic savvy and political cunning as it was about divine devotion. And as we continue to excavate the truths from the myths, there's still more to uncover, more stories to tell, and more mysteries to solve. Keep your hieroglyphs handy, because our journey through ancient Egypt is far from over. And so we find ourselves at the crossroad of ancient myth and modern marvel, where the sands of time reveal not just relics, but reflections of ourselves. Ancient Egyptian religion, with its pantheon of quirky deities and elaborate rituals, was more than an ancient pastime. It was the blueprint for a society that thrived for over 3 millennia. It laid the foundations for future civilizations and left a legacy that's as enduring as the pyramids themselves. Let's start with the Greeks and Romans, those notorious cultural magpies who couldn't resist picking up a few Egyptian tricks. The Greeks, for instance, were so enamored with Isis that they adopted her into their pantheon, giving her a makeover as the goddess of seafaring. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, borrowed the concept of divine rulers, a nod to the pharaohs, which helped bolster the egos of emperors from Augustus to Constantine. Even the architectural grandeur of Egyptian temples found echoes in Roman basilicas and public buildings. And let's not forget mummification. The Romans adopted it, albeit with less religious fervor, turning it into more of a status symbol than a spiritual journey. Fast forward a few centuries, and we see Egyptian motifs cropping up in Freemasonry, that secretive society full of handshakes and hieroglyphs. They loved the symbolism of the all-seeing eye of Horus, because what's a secret society without a little mystery? And during the 19th century, as European powers scrambled to carve up Africa like a Christmas turkey, Egyptomania swept the continent. Everyone from Napoleon to the Victorians wanted a piece of the action, or at least a nice obelisk for the garden. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 was like hitting the linguistic jackpot, enabling scholars to decipher hieroglyphs and opening up ancient Egypt to the curious minds of the West. But why does ancient Egyptian religion still captivate us today? Well, part of it is the allure of the unknown. Mummies and pharaohs, with their air of mystery and grandeur, offer a glimpse into a world as remote and exotic as the stars. And let's face it, who doesn't love a good tomb-raiding adventure? Yet, beyond the glitz of Hollywood and the myths we've debunked, there's a deeper fascination with how a civilization so ancient could be so advanced. They mastered architecture, developed a calendar that put the rest of the ancient world to shame, and their medical practices weren't just cutting-edge. They were cutting-edge with obsidian scalpels. Moreover, ancient Egyptian religion holds a mirror to our own quest for immortality. Today, we have cryogenics and AI, but the Egyptians had pyramids and Book of the Dead. It's a testament to human nature that we're still grappling with the same existential dilemmas: life, death, and what comes after. The Egyptian belief in an eternal afterlife, where you could enjoy all the pleasures of this world, resonates with our own hopes of a hereafter free from the daily grind. And speaking of eternity, let's talk tombs. The majestic pyramids and intricate burial sites weren't just resting places. They were statements of power and prestige. They whispered, "Look upon my works, ye mighty," and despair, long before Shelley penned Ozymandias. These were the ultimate status symbols, the ancient equivalent of a billionaire's super yacht. They told the world, and the guards, that here lay someone important, someone worth remembering. And it worked. We're still talking about them thousands of years later. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient Egyptian religion is its testament to human creativity and resilience. Here was a society that turned the harshest environment into a cradle of civilization, blending spirituality with practicality to create a culture that was as robust as it was intricate. The Egyptians believed in order amidst chaos, a balance that kept their world spinning. And in a time where chaos seems to loom large, perhaps that's the most timeless lesson of all. So, dear listeners, as you close this chapter on the divine drama that was ancient Egypt, remember that beneath the myths and mummies lies a story of humanity striving to make sense of the universe. It's a narrative of gods and mortals, of life and afterlife, and of a legacy written in the stars and sand. Even as we dig through the remnants of this ancient world, we find echoes of our own hopes, fears, and dreams. The story of ancient Egypt may have ended, but its legacy lives on, a testament to the eternal dance between myth and reality. And there you have it, the last curtain call on our Egyptian extravaganza. Until next time, keep your wits sharp and your hieroglyphs handy, because history is full of surprises, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. In a world where swords were the ultimate fashion accessory, and honor could be sliced as thin as sashimi, feudal Japan was a hierarchical spectacle that would make any modern-day corporate ladder look like child's play. At the top, we had the emperor, the pristine figurehead akin to a ceremonial teapot. beautiful, revered, but not exactly brewing any power plays. The real action happened behind the scenes with the shogun, the true puppet master pulling the strings of this kabuki theater of governance. Let's dive into the social soup of feudal Japan. At the peak of this pyramid, the emperor sat in Kyoto, a city that was the capital from 794 to 1868, exuding an aura of untouchable divinity. But don't let the halo fool you. His role was more symbolic than strategic. If the emperor was the iPhone in the display case, then the shogun was the one swiping through apps and making the calls. This military dictator, ruling from his own political epicenter, had the real might. The first official shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo, took the reins in 1192, kicking off an era that lasted until 1867, when the Meiji Restoration rolled in like a tsunami of Western influence. Next in line were the daimyo, the landowning lords who managed chunks of the country like it was their personal monopoly board. These guys were the ones who hired the samurai, those sword-wielding legends we all know and love. But let's clear something up. Samurais were not the noble knights they're often painted as. Sure, they had a code, the Bushido, a set of rules that mixed the zen of a monk with the discipline of a marine. But let's not gloss over the fact that they were also highly paid mercenaries. During the Edo period, a samurai's income could be measured in koku, the amount of rice needed to feed one man for a year. Some samurais earned as much as 10,000 koku annually. That's a lot of sushi rolls, folks. Now, if you're conjuring images of samurais lounging in opulent mansions, think again. Many lived closer to the edge of poverty than prosperity, often resorting to side gigs like farming or even craftsmanship to make ends meet. Life wasn't all cherry blossoms and katana duels. It was more like a balancing act on a sword's edge. Below the samurai were the peasants, the backbone of the agrarian economy. These folks were the unsung heroes, the roadies in this historical rock concert, toiling away in rice paddies from dawn till dusk. Peasants made up about 80% of the population, and while their contribution was critical, their status was anything but glamorous. They were taxed to the hilt, with the government skimming off about 40-50% of their output. Imagine working your fingers to the bone, only to hand half your paycheck to your boss before you even get to see it. Talk about rough. On the next rung down were the artisans and craftsmen, the creative types who were a notch above the peasants, but still far from the lap of luxury. These were the folks who made everything from pottery to swords, adding color and utility to everyday life. And just when you thought the social ladder couldn't get any more rickety, along came the merchants. Despite their wealth, they were considered the lowest of the low in this feudal hierarchy. Why, you ask? Because they made their money off the labor of others without producing anything themselves, a big no-no in the value system of the time. So, there you have it, a social structure as rigid as a samurai stare, each level with its own quirks and pitfalls. From the supposedly divine emperor to the merchants scrabbling at the base, every tier was a cog in the grand machine of feudal Japan. But hold on to your kimonos, because we're just getting started. There's plenty more myth-busting and historical reality checks on the horizon. Now, let's unsheath the truth about the samurai, those iconic warriors who were as much a part of Japan's landscape as Mount Fuji is today. You see, romanticized image of the samurai is a bit like thinking of ninjas as turtle mutants, entertaining but wildly inaccurate. They weren't just noble heroes in gleaming armor, ready to die for honor at the drop of a hat. Life for them was a mixed bag of discipline, duty, and surprisingly drama. At the heart of the samurai ethos was Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code as revered as it was misunderstood. Think of Bushido as a cocktail of Confucian loyalty, Zen calmness, and a dash of martial prowess. This wasn't just a weakened warrior's guide to swordplay. It embodied ideals like loyalty, honor, and self-discipline. But here's the kicker. Bushido was more of an ideal than a reality. Much like a New Year's resolution, it was often honored in the breach. Sure, some samurai lived by these tenets, but others were more flexible, bending the rules when it suited them, especially when the rice bowls were running empty. Speaking of rice, let's not forget that samurai were as much about economics as they were about eloquence with a blade. The koku, a unit of rice that fed one person for a year, was the currency of the realm. A high-ranking samurai might receive a stipend of thousands of koku, while lower-ranked ones might barely scrape by. And guess what? Not all samurai were out there slicing through foes on the battlefield. Many were desk-bound bureaucrats, more familiar with calligraphy brushes than katana blades. The paperwork wasn't just a modern-day office plague. It was alive, and well back then, too. Financial headaches were as common for samurai as they are for us today. They had to maintain an image, which wasn't cheap. Armor, horses, and weapons were no small expense. Some samurai found themselves moonlighting in side hustles like farming or craftsmanship, because let's face it, honor doesn't pay the bills. It's a little less Last Samurai, and a bit more samurai side hustle. Now, as we pivot to the peasantry, the real MVPs of feudal Japan, it's worth noting that their lives were about as romantic as a Monday morning rush hour. These folks were the backbone of the economy, laboring in rice fields under the watchful eyes of their samurai overseers. Picture this. About 80% of the population was made up of peasants, and they were taxed at rates that would make modern taxpayers weep. Imagine coughing up 40-50% of your hard-earned rice crop to keep the ruling classes comfortable. That's not a tax. That's daylight robbery, only sanctioned by the powers that be. Despite their critical economic role, peasants were often viewed as little more than necessary cogs in the feudal machine. Their lives were governed by the seasons, their fortunes as unpredictable as the weather. Yet, they were remarkably resilient, forming tight-knit communities that celebrated festivals and traditions, offering some respite from the relentless toil. But before you think it was all doom and gloom, the peasantry wasn't entirely devoid of power. In some regions, they organized themselves into self-governing communities, negotiating terms with local lords. It's a bit like forming a medieval union, and while they couldn't exactly storm the shogun's castle, they made their voices heard in their own way. The intricate dance between the samurai and the peasantry was a reflection of the broader social order. Each depended on the other, yet their lives were worlds apart. For the samurai, honor and duty were guiding stars, albeit ones that occasionally flickered under economic strain. For the peasants, survival was the name of the game, with community and tradition offering solace amidst the struggle. This complex interplay of class and economy is what made feudal Japan the fascinating tapestry it was. It wasn't just sword fights under cherry blossoms. It was a society striving to balance ideals with the stark realities of life. So, as we look past the myths and legends, we uncover a world where every social tier had its own battles, whether on the battlefield or in the rice fields. And just like that, the layers of this historical onion continue to peel back, revealing ever more intriguing insights into the past. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. Feudal Japan's social hierarchy was a bit like a theater production where the lead actors were paupers in fancy costumes, while the backstage crew, often overlooked, were raking in the dough. Enter the artisans and merchants, the unsung heroes of this historical drama. While they were officially perched precariously near the bottom of the social ladder, their economic prowess often overshadowed their supposed betters. Talk about a plot twist. Artisans were the creative minds behind the beautiful swords, the intricate pottery, and those iconic tea sets that made Japanese culture distinct. They were the ones turning raw materials into objects of value, which is no small feat when you're living in a society that values the sword over the pen, or in this case, the brush and chisel. Despite their crucial skills, artisans were considered just a step above peasants, a bit like being the vice president of a company that only has 2 employees. But here's the kicker. In many cases, they were better off financially than the samurai, those emblematic warriors who were supposed to be the envy of everyone. Take Kyoto, for example. By the Edo period, this city was a bustling hub for artisans, a place where you could find everything from exquisite silk kimonos to delicate lacquerware. Artisans in such urban centers could thrive, creating goods that even the samurai desired but couldn't always afford. These creative types often lived in specialized districts, forming guilds that controlled production quality and prices, a medieval version of quality control with a dash of unionizing spirit. So, while they might have been lower on the social scale, their craftsmanship was in high demand, giving them a surprising amount of leverage. Then there were the merchants, the true underdogs of the feudal system. In a society that preached the virtues of producing over profiting from others' labor, merchants were seen as necessary evils. They didn't create anything tangible. They merely facilitated trade, which was apparently just a fancy way of saying they took advantage of others' work. Yet, irony had the last laugh here, because while merchants were officially the lowest of the low, they often laughed all the way to the rice bank. During the Edo period, Japan's economy began to shift from a purely agrarian society to one with burgeoning urban centers. This meant that merchants, once considered economic parasites, suddenly found themselves in a position of power. They were the ones who kept the rice and the money flowing. Take Osaka, known as the nation's kitchen, where merchants controlled the distribution of rice. This wasn't just a local gig. They were the brokers of the entire country's staple food, a bit like controlling the distribution of smartphones today. And we all know what happens when you control the supply chain. You call the shots. Merchants became adept at navigating the class system's rigid rules by forming zaibatsu, family-run business conglomerates that would make a modern CEO green with envy. They pooled resources, diversified their investments, and established networks across the country. While they didn't have social prestige, they had something arguably better, economic power. And let's be real, in a world where even samurais were sometimes strapped for cash, money spoke louder than Bushido. But it wasn't just about accumulating wealth. The savvy merchants were also adept at using their riches to buy influence. They funded public works, lent money to cash-strapped samurai, and even financed the arts, becoming patrons of kabuki theater and ukiyo-e prints. In a way, they were the silent architects of cultural development in Japan, shaping the way society looked and felt, even if they weren't supposed to be the stars of the show. And then there's the myth that feudal Japan was a static, unchanging society, a notion about as accurate as a samurai wielding a lightsaber. The truth is, change was constant, albeit slow. While the class structure might have appeared as rigid as a bamboo stalk, the reality was that it was more like a bamboo forest, flexible, interconnected, and constantly growing. Take the case of the merchant class rising to prominence. By the late Edo period, some merchants were so wealthy that they could afford to marry their daughters into samurai families, effectively buying status for the next generation. This wasn't just about love. It was a strategic alliance that blurred the lines between classes. And let's not forget the role of the Bakufu, the Tokugawa shogunate's government, which subtly adapted to these changes by allowing certain exceptions to the rigid social order when it suited them, especially when it came to tax revenue. Cultural shifts were happening, too. As merchants gained wealth, they began to patronize arts that were once the exclusive domain of the elite. They sponsored theaters, hosted salons, and commissioned art, laying the groundwork for Japan's rich cultural heritage. These developments weren't just side notes. They were crucial in transforming Japan from a feudal backwater into a vibrant cultural powerhouse. So, while the official narrative might paint feudal Japan as a land of unyielding tradition, the truth is far more dynamic. It was a society in flux, where the boundaries between classes could be as fluid as a stream. Merchants and artisans, though officially low in status, were the very engines of change, proving that economic power often trumps social hierarchy. As we peel back the layers of this historical tapestry, it becomes clear that the story of feudal Japan is one of complexity and contradiction, where the so-called underdogs were often pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But hold onto your kimonos, because there's more intrigue and drama yet to unfold. So, while the official narrative might paint feudal Japan as a land of unyielding tradition, the truth is far more dynamic. But let's pivot from merchants and artisans to the women of feudal Japan, because oh boy, do they deserve a spotlight of their own. If you thought they were just characters in the background, think again. Women in this era were far from the delicate flowers often depicted in ukiyo-e prints. They were more like bamboo, flexible yet unbreakable, and often found a way to bend the rules more than a few times. Let's start with the samurai class. Picture the samurai wife, an image often glossed over in the romantic tales of noble warriors. But these women were no mere arm candy. They were the CFOs of their households, managing the estate, finances, and even the workforce when their husbands were off slicing enemies, or more likely, doing bureaucratic paperwork. These women wielded tanto, short swords, not just for decoration, but as a last line of defense when invaders called. And yes, they were trained in martial arts like naginata, a pole weapon that was both a tool of empowerment and a necessity in those turbulent times. In fact, Let's give a shout-out to Tamo Gozen, a warrior extraordinaire who fought in the late 12th century. Legend has it she was as skilled with a bow and arrow as she was with a sword. She even led troops into battle during the Genpei, making her one of the most celebrated female samurai in history. Though her story sounds like it sprung from the pages of a comic book, it's a real testament to the fact that women could and did fight alongside men when the situation demanded. But the influence of women wasn't limited to the battlefield. Fast forward to the Edo period, and you'll find that women were the unsung heroines of the arts and culture. Take the world of the geisha, for instance. Contrary to the Western misconception that geishas were courtesans, these women were artists par excellence, trained in classical music, dance, and social graces. Think of them as the influencers of their time, wielding cultural capital rather than swords, and often influencing the men who held political and economic power. They were more like cultural diplomats, bridging social gaps with their performances and conversations. And let's not forget the economic contributions of women in the merchant class. While their husbands were busy trading, many women managed the household businesses. They were the ones ensuring that the family shop ran smoothly, often making critical financial decisions. In certain cases, these women even outlived and outperformed their male counterparts in business acumen. It wasn't uncommon for widows to take over the family enterprise and run it with the competence of a seasoned CEO. The textiles industry, for example, was one area where women dominated. They were the primary producers of silk and cotton goods, working as both artisans and entrepreneurs. The silk produced in Japan was considered a luxury item, highly sought after and pricey. So much so that by the late Edo period, Japan was exporting large quantities to China and the West. Women were at the heart of this economic engine, weaving not just fabric, but the economic tapestry of entire regions. But this doesn't mean women had it easy. Far from it. The societal norms of the time were as restrictive as a tight obi around a kimono. Women were expected to marry and produce heirs, and their social status was often tied to their husband's rank. If a woman was widowed, her options could be limited unless she had the means to sustain herself or remarry. Yet, despite these constraints, women found ways to wield influence and power, often in the shadows, but sometimes stepping boldly into the light. Education was another area where women left their mark, albeit quietly. Though formal education was largely reserved for men, many women were literate and well-versed in the arts, thanks to the tutelage they received at home. The diary of Murasaki Shikibu, author of The Tale of Genji, gives us a glimpse into the literary prowess of women in earlier periods. This was a time when a woman's ability to compose poetry or understand complex literature could elevate her social standing. So, while the romanticized image of the demure, passive Japanese woman persists in popular culture, history tells a different story. The women of feudal Japan were multifaceted, warriors, entrepreneurs, artists, and more, contributing to society in ways that were both visible and hidden. Their stories, often marginalized or obscured, reveal the complexity and dynamism of a society that was far more than just samurais and cherry blossoms. As we peel back the layers of this historical narrative, it becomes clear that the story of feudal Japan is incomplete without acknowledging the roles women played across all strata. They were not just supporting characters in the grand play of history. They were essential actors, influencing the script in ways both subtle and profound. But fear not, our journey through this fascinating tapestry isn't over yet. There's still more to uncover and more myths to bust as we continue to explore the intricate world of feudal Japan. As we continue our jaunt through the intricate social tapestry of feudal Japan, it's time to play the final act of this historical drama, the decline of the shogunate, a saga riddled with internal strife and external pressures that makes Game of Thrones look like a Sunday picnic. Feudal Japan's social structure, once as rigid as a bamboo stick, began to crack under the weight of its own contradictions and the irresistible force of global change. So, what kicked off the unraveling of this centuries-old system? Well, it turns out that even the most formidable samurai can't slice through the relentless march of economic necessity. By the mid-19th century, Japan's isolationist policy, sakoku, was beginning to feel more like a straitjacket than a safety blanket. While the rest of the world was getting cozy with the Industrial Revolution, Japan was still plodding along with a medieval economy. Picture trying to win a Formula One race in a horse-drawn carriage. Enter Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships in 1853, carrying a message from the United States that was less of a diplomatic missive and more of a nice country you got here. Shame if something happened to it. The result, the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, opening up Japan to foreign trade. It was like opening Pandora's box with a side of sushi. Internally, tensions were simmering like a pot of miso soup left on the flame too long. The Tokugawa shogunate, the last feudal military government, was hanging on by a thread, while the shogun's court in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, was immersed in its own grandeur. The daimyo, those landowning lords, were growing restless. They were like teenagers itching to rebel against their helicopter parents. Economic strains, compounded by natural disasters and crop failures, were leaving peasants hungry and disgruntled. This was a society ripe for change, and change did come, albeit in the form of the Meiji Restoration of 1868, a revolution packaged in politeness but seismic in impact. The Meiji Restoration was Japan's bold leap from feudal isolation to modern nationhood. It was less like a gentle transition and more akin to ripping off a band-aid. The emperor, who had been more of a decorative figurehead than a ruler, was thrust into the spotlight, taking on a role that was part monarch, part PR wizard. The new Meiji government was on a mission to catch up with the West, and fast. It dismantled the feudal system, abolished the samurai class, and introduced a conscripted military. Samurai warriors, once the rock stars of Japanese society, found themselves out of a job, their swords swapped for suits as they transitioned to bureaucratic roles. Talk about a career change. Economically, the Meiji era was a whirlwind. Japan embraced industrialization with the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy store. Railways, telegraph lines, and factories mushroomed across the country. The introduction of a new tax system, based on land ownership rather than rice production, shook up the rural economy. Peasants, who had long shouldered the burden of taxation, found themselves in a new world where their contribution was measured not by the amount of rice harvested, but by cash, cold and hard. In a sense, Japan was metamorphosing from a caterpillar into a butterfly, albeit a butterfly with gears and pistons. As Japan entered the 20th century, the echoes of its feudal past lingered. The samurai spirit, Bushido, was repurposed into a national ethos, a way to foster unity and discipline in a rapidly modernizing nation. The military adopted it, turning the code into a tool for motivation, and later, militaristic expansion. It's a stark reminder that ideals, however noble, can be twisted to fit new agendas. The Bushido that once guided individual warriors became a rallying cry for imperial ambition, leading Japan into conflicts that culminated disastrously in World War II. Now, what lessons does this tale of feudal Japan offer us in our modern world? For starters, it highlights the dangers of isolation in an interconnected globe. While Japan's Sakoku policy preserved its culture from foreign influence, it also left the nation ill-prepared for the industrial age. The swift pivot to modernization under the Meiji Restoration was as much a necessity as it was a choice, showcasing the need for adaptability in the face of global shifts. It's a lesson as relevant today as it was in the 19th century, in a world where technological and economic changes continue at breakneck speed. Moreover, the dismantling of the rigid caste system reminds us of the importance of social mobility. In feudal Japan, your fate was largely sealed by birth, a system that stifled innovation and progress. The Meiji era's reforms, though painful, paved the way for a more inclusive society, where talent, rather than hereditary privilege, could rise to the top. The transformation was far from perfect and had its share of new inequalities, but it was a step towards a more dynamic and open society. As for the myths that continue to color our perception of feudal Japan, they persist because they capture our imagination. Stories of noble samurai, mysterious ninjas, and graceful geishas. They are the stuff of legends, romanticized and idealized, but they obscure the gritty reality of a world that was as complex and flawed as any society. The real Japan was a land of contradictions, where beauty and brutality coexisted, where the rigid social order was both a source of strength and a shackle. So, As we wrap up this historical journey, we're left with the realization that while the players and circumstances may have changed, the human drama remains the same. The struggle for power, the quest for economic stability, the push for social justice. These are the threads that weave through the fabric of history, binding our past to our present. As we navigate our own era of rapid change, perhaps there's wisdom to be found in looking back at the lessons of feudal Japan, a society that was forced to adapt or perish, to reinvent itself in the face of inevitable transformation. In the end, history is not just about dates and events. It's about understanding the forces that shape societies and the choices that define eras. It's about recognizing the myths we tell ourselves and questioning the narratives we inherit. So, as we bid farewell to the shoguns and samurai, the peasants and merchants, let's carry forward the insights gleaned from their world into our own, ever mindful that we're all just actors in a timeless play, each generation writing its own script on the stage of history. The first light of dawn barely creeps through the cracks when the bell rings out, echoing through stone corridors and tugging you from the warmth of your straw mattress. It's the medieval monastery's equivalent of your smartphone alarm, only there's no snooze button. Welcome to the start of another meticulously scheduled day, where time is measured not by the ticks of a clock, but by the toll of bells and the rhythm of prayers known as the canonical hours. You're living in what could be described as the original 24/7 lifestyle, minus the internet and caffeine fixes. Your day kicks off with matins, the very first of the 8 canonical hours. Think of it as your early morning meeting, but instead of PowerPoint slides, you're flipping through Psalms. Matins is a pre-dawn prayer service that sets the spiritual tone for the day. You shuffle into the church, joining your fellow monks in chanting. The Latin echoes off the cold stone, and you might wonder if this is what a Gregorian Spotify playlist would sound like, minus the ads. This regimented life is governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, a rule book that makes your company handbook look like light reading. Benedict's mantra was ora et labora, prayer and work. It's the medieval version of work-life balance, where spiritual duties blend seamlessly with manual labor. The idea was to keep monks too busy to get into trouble, a strategy parents today might recognize. The day is punctuated by these prayer sessions as regularly as your phone buzzes with reminders. After matins, there's lauds at dawn, prime at the first hour of daylight, terce mid-morning, and so forth. Each prayer session is a chance to recalibrate, a reset button for your soul, if you will. The monks might not have had deadlines, but they sure had a packed schedule. Now, you might be curious, how did they keep this tight schedule without the convenience of Timex or Casio? Here's the scoop. Monks used water clocks, sundials, and the position of the sun to measure time. Some monasteries even had mechanical clocks, which, let's be honest, were less of a clock and more of a medieval Rube Goldberg machine. These contraptions were marvels of their age, using weights and gears to mark the hours with a bell. It's the kind of innovation that makes you appreciate your digital watch. With each prayer session, you dive deeper into the spiritual ocean, binding yourself to the divine rhythm that dictated every monk's life. The canonical hours were more than just time markers. They were spiritual anchors in a chaotic world. You see, the medieval mind viewed time as a divine gift, and the regimented day was a way to honor that gift. It's a stark contrast to our modern hustle, where time often feels like an enemy. This routine might sound monotonous, but it's also a source of stability in a world where life expectancy hovered around 30 years, and the Black Death was a not-so-distant memory. By the way, did you know that some historians estimate the Black Death wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century? That's a mortality rate that would make even the most hardened epidemiologist gulp. While the prayer schedule was non-negotiable, there was a surprising amount of flexibility in how monks spent their work hours. Depending on the abbey, you could find yourself brewing beer, tending sheep, or copying manuscripts. And yes, contrary to popular belief, not all monks were scribes hunched over parchment. Some were basically medieval farmers, and others, believe it or not, were the original craft brewers. Monasteries were often self-sufficient economic units, producing goods that were traded or sold. But let's not romanticize monastic life too much. This wasn't a spiritual retreat with plush amenities. Life in a monastery was hard. The food was simple, mostly bread and vegetable stew, Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a college student's diet. And while the vow of poverty meant monks didn't own personal property, the monastery itself often held vast tracts of land and wealth. It's like living in a mansion where you own nothing but your robe and your rosary. As the morning passes, the bell tolls again, calling you to the next prayer service. This cycle of prayer, work, and reflection creates a rhythm that's both comforting and relentless. You might find this structure surprisingly appealing, a kind of forced mindfulness in an age where survival was the primary concern. The day marches on, each hour marked by the resonant tolling of the bell. While the outside world spins with chaos, wars, plagues, and political intrigue, the monastery stands as a bastion of order and spiritual focus. It's a place where time is not just a sequence of moments, but a sacred tapestry, woven with devotion and discipline. So, as you move from matins through the morning hours, you're not just keeping a schedule, you're participating in a centuries-old tradition that shaped medieval life. It's a world where faith and practicality walk hand in hand, where the divine is found not just in prayer, but in the mundane tasks of daily life. And as the bell rings once more, you're reminded that in this cloistered world, time is not just of the essence, it's the essence itself. As the bell fades into silence, you and your fellow monks shuffle off to the refectory for breakfast, where the real medieval magic happens, not in the alchemy of turning lead into gold, but in transforming humble ingredients into sustenance. Picture a long wooden table, more Hogwarts than haute cuisine, laden with stoneware bowls and trays. The fare. Think farm to table before it was trendy, a minimalist menu of grains, vegetables, and if you're in luck, a bit of fish. Forget about bacon and eggs. This is all about keeping it simple and soulful. Rule of St. Benedict dictated not just the spiritual, but also the gastronomic life of the monastery. The monks weren't counting macros or carbs, but they did follow strict dietary rules. Meat from four-legged animals was mostly off the menu, reserved for the infirmary, where sick monks got the medieval equivalent of chicken soup. Instead, the diet leaned heavily on bread and pottage, kind of thick vegetable stew. Bread, often made from barley or rye, was the cornerstone, literally and figuratively, of the monastic meal. It was not just sustenance, but a symbol of shared life, baked in ovens that were as much community hubs as they were culinary tools. Now, if you're wondering how they kept this Spartan menu from becoming a culinary Groundhog Day, here's the twist: fish. While meat was a no-go, fish was a holy loophole. Monasteries often had their own fish ponds or access to nearby rivers, making fish a staple. This wasn't just a dietary preference. It was an economic strategy. Fish could be traded and sold, turning a simple meal into a financial asset. It's a reminder that even in a world governed by piety, practicality ruled the day. But here's where things get juicy, literally. Monasteries were also home to some of the earliest breweries. Yes, those monks were the original craft beer hipsters, brewing ale long before it was cool. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was liquid bread, a crucial part of the diet. In a time when water quality was suspect at best, beer was a safer choice, and the brewing process was an art form. Monks experimented with hops and fermentation, creating brews that were both nourishing and, let's face it, a little intoxicating. Monastic brewing was a serious business, both economically and spiritually. The ale was consumed daily, but it was also a commodity. Monasteries became economic hubs, producing beer for sale and trade. The profits helped sustain the community, maintain the buildings, and fund charitable works. In a sense, the monks were medieval entrepreneurs, turning grains into gold, or at least something close to it. This self-sufficiency extended beyond the brewery. Monasteries were like little economic engines, combining faith with farming. The monks were masters of agriculture, cultivating fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. They grew wheat, barley, and vegetables, raising sheep and cattle on lush pastures. The monastery was often the largest landowner in the area, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by the local nobility. In some cases, monasteries were so economically powerful that they could rival the influence of the local lord, which, let's be honest, probably didn't win them any popularity contests. And while we're myth-busting, let's tackle the idea of monks as reclusive hermits. Sure, they lived cloistered lives, but that didn't mean they were isolated from the world. Monasteries were bustling centers of activity, drawing in pilgrims, traders, and laborers. The monks might have taken vows of silence, but the world around them was anything but quiet. They were plugged into the medieval social network, a kind of Facebook without the friend requests. As you spoon up your morning porridge, it's worth reflecting on the delicate balance between the spiritual and the practical. The monks' diet was frugal, but it was also a testament to resourcefulness and resilience. They embraced simplicity not just as a spiritual discipline, but as a way to navigate a world that was often brutal and unpredictable. It's a lesson in making do with less, in finding richness in restraint, a perspective that feels both ancient and utterly relevant today. And so, as breakfast winds down and the bowls are cleared, you're reminded that in this cloistered world, food is more than just fuel. It's a ritual, a reflection of the community's values, and a reminder of the interconnectedness of life. You're not just eating, you're participating in a tradition that has nourished both body and soul for centuries. The bell tolls again, ushering in the next chapter of the day, but the echoes of breakfast linger, a savory reminder of the monastic blend of prayer, work, and yes, the occasional sip of ale. As breakfast fades into history, you shuffle along with your monastic crew toward the scriptorium, the intellectual heart of the monastery, where monks become the medieval equivalent of USB drives. Here, you'll spend your day hunched over parchment, quill in hand, transforming the latest shipment of vellum into what future historians will call priceless manuscripts. But let's be real. This isn't the serene, candlelit haven you've seen in movies. It's more like a medieval sweatshop for scribes, minus the air conditioning and ergonomic chairs. Welcome to the scriptorium, where silence is golden and ink stains are the new black. This is where the magic happens, or rather, where the painstakingly mundane occurs. Each monk is tasked with copying texts word for word, a process about as thrilling as watching paint dry. But don't be fooled by the monotony. These guys are the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages, painstakingly preserving knowledge one letter at a time. They're the reason you can still read Aristotle or Virgil today, provided your Latin's up to snuff. Speaking of Latin, it's the lingua franca of the monastery, the universal language that binds the medieval intellectual world together. While the rest of the world is busy speaking their local dialects, monks are here conjugating verbs like it's their day job. Because, well, it is. Latin isn't just a language. It's the key to a treasure trove of ancient wisdom, a bridge to the classical past that monks are determined to keep from crumbling into obscurity. Now, let's talk about why this matters. In a world where most people couldn't read, monasteries were the Ivy Leagues of their day. Literacy was a rare and precious skill, mostly reserved for the clergy and some lucky nobles. The ability to read and write was like having a VIP pass to the intellectual club, and monks were its most dedicated members. They weren't just copying religious texts either. They were engaged in preserving and sometimes even translating scientific works, philosophical treatises, and medical texts. You could say monasteries were the libraries of the Middle Ages, long before Dewey came up with his decimal system. But let's not romanticize the idea of monks as serene scholars. The reality was far less idyllic. Copying a book by hand was a Herculean task, taking months, sometimes even years. A single Bible could take a skilled scribe upwards of a decade to complete, and that's assuming no one sneezed and ruined a page. The tools of the trade were primitive, quills made from goose feathers, ink concocted from oak galls, and parchment made from animal skin. It's enough to make you appreciate the Control+C, Control+V of modern times. Imagine sitting in a chilly room, the only light coming from narrow windows or flickering candles, your hands cramping from hours of meticulous writing. There's no room for error. A single mistake means starting over or creating a correction so conspicuous it's like a flashing neon sign screaming, "Oops." And while we're busting myths, let's debunk the idea that monks worked in silence, surrounded by nothing but the gentle rustle of parchment. The scriptorium was often bustling with activity, monks muttering to themselves as they copied, the scratch of quills on parchment, and the occasional groan of frustration when someone blots the page. Economically speaking, books were the luxury goods of the medieval world. A single manuscript could cost the equivalent of a small farm, priceless not just for its content, but for the sheer labor involved in its creation. Monasteries often funded their operations through the sale of these manuscripts, making them both cultural and economic powerhouses. And before you think this was just a quaint little cottage industry, consider that some monasteries churned out manuscripts with the efficiency of a medieval assembly line. It was big business, and the scribes were the assembly workers, each one a cog in the intellectual machine of the Middle Ages. Yet, even amidst the ink stains and eye strain, there's something undeniably romantic about the scriptorium. It's a place where the past comes alive, where ancient voices speak through the hands of dedicated monks. The scriptorium is a testament to human perseverance, a reminder that even in a world without digital backups, there was a relentless drive to preserve knowledge. As you sit there, copying the words of long-dead authors, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries, a chain of learning that links the past with the present. The scriptorium is more than just a room. It's a monument to human curiosity and the enduring power of the written word. And as the bell tolls, signaling the end of another painstaking session, you can't help but feel a little awe for these medieval data storage devices. They may not have known the term information age, but they sure laid the groundwork for it. So there you are, not just a monk, but a guardian of knowledge, a humble scribe in a grand tradition. You're part of a legacy that will outlast the stones of the monastery, a builder of bridges between the past and the future. And as the day progresses, you realize that in this world of prayer and parchment, every word you copy is a step toward eternity. As the bell's final toll echoes through the ancient stone halls, a new chapter of your monastic day unfolds, a chapter as grounded in the earth as it is in heaven. Here, in the afternoon, laborer takes center stage. It's time to swap your quill for a spade, your parchment for plows, and dive into the gritty, tangible world of medieval manual labor. This isn't just any work. It's a sacred ritual, the physical counterpart to your morning spiritual exercises. Welcome to the monastery's bustling ecosystem, where every monk plays a part in this divine drama of dirt and devotion. You might be sent to the gardens, where the air is thick with the scent of herbs and soil. Forget your modern-day Zen garden. This is a medieval farmer's paradise, a patchwork of greens and browns meticulously planned to feed the body and nourish the soul. Tending these gardens isn't just about growing food, it's about cultivating virtue. Every weed pulled, every seed sown is a step on the path to spiritual enlightenment. It's a workout for the body and a boot camp for the soul, a fact that would surely make modern fitness gurus nod in ecclesiastical approval. And then there's carpentry. If you find yourself among the woodworkers, you might be crafting everything from furniture to farm tools. Imagine the satisfying thunk of a mallet on wood, the smell of sawdust hanging in the air like incense. This is where monks become medieval-handed, turning raw timber into functional art. It's a skill that's part survival, part spirituality, and entirely essential. After all, someone has to keep those monastery roofs from turning into medieval waterfalls during the rainy season. Now, while your hands are busy, let's take a moment to appreciate the broader role of monasteries in this medieval universe. They were more than just spiritual retreats. They were the original one-stop shops, offering everything from spiritual salvation to economic stability. Picture this. Monasteries owned huge swaths of land, making them some of the most significant landlords of their time. And these weren't just barren fields. They were meticulously managed estates producing everything from grains to grapes, the latter being particularly important for a certain holy beverage. Ah, the wine cellar. Every monk's secret garden of earthly delights and managerial headaches. Being in charge of the wine was a task fraught with both temptation and responsibility. On one hand, you had access to some of the finest vintages, a perk that could make even the most pious monk's vow of temperance wobble. On the other hand, you had to manage the inventory with the precision of a medieval accountant. Each barrel was a liquid asset, with its own economic and social value, not to mention the divine significance when it came to celebrating Mass. A miscount here could lead to more than just a shortfall in spirits. It could spark a crisis in the community. Talk about pressure. Now, here's a juicy tidbit. Despite their vows of poverty, many monasteries were rolling in wealth. They were the Jeff Bezoses of the medieval world, minus the space rockets. This wealth came from various sources: land rents, agricultural produce, and yes, that wine cellar. But before you start picturing monks lounging in opulence, let's bust that myth. The wealth was communal, not personal. Monastic life meant giving up personal possessions, but it didn't mean living in squalor. The riches were used to sustain the monastery, support the local community, and fund charitable works. You could say monks were the original social entrepreneurs, reinvesting their profits for the greater good. And speaking of community, monasteries were the medieval version of a social hub, provided everything from education to healthcare, acting as hospitals, schools, and guest houses. Pilgrims, travelers, and locals alike found refuge within their walls. This made monasteries politically and socially influential, sometimes rivaling even the local nobility in power. And with great power comes, well, great politics. Monasteries had to navigate the complex feudal landscape, balancing their spiritual missions with the very real demands of secular rulers. It was a tightrope walk that required both divine guidance and earthly savvy. Let's not forget the allure of monastic asceticism. The image of the self-denying monk living a life of frugality and poverty is a compelling one. Yet, the reality was more nuanced. While individual monks lived simply, the monastery itself was often a microcosm of wealth and influence. This duality can be hard to reconcile, but it's essential to understanding the monastic world. It's a reminder that human nature and divine calling are rarely straightforward. As the afternoon sun begins to dip, casting long shadows over the monastery grounds, you can't help but marvel at the intricate tapestry of monastic life. It's a world where the sacred and the mundane are woven together, where every task, no matter how humble, carries a spiritual significance. Whether you're turning soil or turning pages, you're part of a grand tradition that marries labor with liturgy, work with worship. So, as you finish your day's labor, you're left with a sense of accomplishment and a touch of humility. You've tilled the earth, crafted wood, and maybe even wrestled with the temptations of the wine cellar. It's a life as rich in challenges as it is in rewards, a life that offers no easy answers but plenty of meaningful questions. And as the bell tolls once more, signaling the end of your labors, you find yourself looking forward to the next chapter of this monastic journey, whatever that might bring. As you dust the earthy remnants of the day's labor from your robe, the evening bell resonates through the monastery like a celestial gong, calling you to Vespers, the grand finale in your symphony of prayer. Vespers is the spiritual nightcap, a moment to pause and reflect on the divine and mundane tasks that have filled your day. It's a time to balance the spiritual scales, weighing the day's efforts in the sacred ledger of monastic life. Let's dive into the Vespers service itself, a delicate blend of psalms, hymns, and silence, wrapped in the comforting echo of Gregorian chant. This isn't just a religious ritual. It's a nightly recalibration, a chance to align your inner compass before the world slips into darkness. The chants, in Latin of course, are like a spiritual lullaby, soothing and uplifting, reminding you of your place in the grand tapestry of creation. You might find yourself pondering the day's work, the balance between sacred duties and practical chores, the spiritual significance hidden in the everyday. It's like finding poetry in a grocery list or enlightenment in a spreadsheet. But let's not forget the broader stage on which this monastic drama unfolds. Monasteries were medieval society's Swiss army knives, multifunctional, indispensable, and occasionally surprising. They were centers of art and architecture, their walls adorned with frescoes and manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf. Some of Europe's most iconic buildings owe their existence to monastic architects who blended faith and function into stone and glass. Think of the soaring Gothic arches and the intricate rose windows that still inspire awe today, centuries after they were first conceived. These were not mere buildings. They were sermons in stone. And let's talk politics. Monasteries weren't just spiritual retreats. They were power players in the medieval Game of Thrones. They wielded influence like a medieval influencer, their abbots' words carrying weight with kings and popes alike. Some abbots even had the political clout to rival their secular counterparts. Picture them as the original power brokers, navigating the treacherous waters of feudal politics with a rosary in one hand and a strategy scroll in the other. Their influence was both spiritual and temporal, a testament to their dual role in medieval society. But here's where we bust a major myth, the idea of monasteries as isolated, self-contained bubbles. Sure, they were cloistered, but they were far from cut off. In fact, monasteries were bustling hubs of activity. Pilgrims, travelers, and traders frequently passed through their gates, bringing news, goods, and sometimes gossip. The monks themselves ventured out into the world, overseeing estates, managing economic affairs, and sometimes even serving as advisors to royalty. They were plugged into the medieval network, a far cry from the silent, solitary figures often romanticized in popular culture. And let's address that whole vow of silence thing. While some orders embraced silence as a spiritual discipline, most monks communicated quite freely, especially when it came to managing the practical affairs of the monastery. Silence was a tool, not a rule. It was used to foster contemplation, not to stifle conversation. The real isolation was more about focus than seclusion, a way to cut through the noise of the world and tune into the divine frequency. So why does this monastic life, wrapped in rituals and routine, still captivate us today? Perhaps it's the allure of simplicity in an age of complexity, the idea of living a life where every action has meaning, where the mundane becomes sacred. Or maybe it's the timeless appeal of a community bound by shared purpose and discipline, a reminder of the power of collective effort in an increasingly individualistic world. In the end, the medieval monastery is a paradox, both otherworldly and deeply grounded, a place where the celestial and the terrestrial meet in a dance as old as time. It's a world that defies easy categorization, where monks are both spiritual warriors and economic strategists, where the sacred and the secular are two sides of the same coin. And as you close your eyes at the end of this long day, you're left with a sense of awe for the legacy of these medieval men and women who, in their pursuit of the divine, managed to shape the very world we live in. So, there you have it. A day in the life of a medieval monastery, a glimpse into a world that was as complex and vibrant as our own. It's a reminder that history, much like life itself, is a tapestry of contradictions, full of myths and realities, legends and truths. And as we ponder the past, perhaps we can find inspiration for our own journey, a reminder that even the most humble of lives can leave an indelible mark on the sands of time. Napoleon Bonaparte entered the world on the rugged island of Corsica, an outpost with more goats than people and a flair for rebellion. Born on August 15, 1769, just a year after France snagged the island from Genoa, Napoleon was essentially French by a technicality and Corsican to his core. Now, it's easy to imagine little Napoleon as a pint-sized conqueror, but in reality, he was more of a bookish kid with dreams bigger than his physique and a chip on his shoulder the size of Europe. Napoleon's father, Carlo Buonaparte, a lawyer with a taste for political ambition, managed to secure a scholarship for his son to study in mainland France. The catch: young Napoleon had to leave the familiar chaos of Corsica for the precise order of a French military academy. At the tender age of 9, Napoleon was shipped off to the Royal Military School in Brienne-le-Château, a place where the rain was frequent, the food was mediocre, and the company was mostly aristocratic kids who thought Corsica was a backwater of sheep herders. In Brienne, Napoleon stood out like a tricorn hat at a baseball game. He was short, yes, but also fiery and intensely focused, with a mind as sharp as a guillotine. He devoured books on history and strategy, which put him light years ahead of his peers in the art of military thinking. Picture a kid who, instead of swapping comics or playing knights and dragons, spent his free time plotting the fall of ancient cities. His classmates often teased him for his accent and his poverty-stricken background, which only fueled his determination to prove them wrong. Spoiler alert, he did. One nugget of gold from these early days was his ability to turn adversity into advantage, a theme that would follow him throughout his life. Napoleon's scholarship wasn't just a free pass, it was a ticket to the big leagues. By the age of 15, he graduated from Brienne and moved on to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, the only Corsican to do so. Talk about breaking barriers. In Paris, Napoleon was a whirlwind of ambition, completing a 2-year course in just 1 year. He specialized in artillery, because if you're going to make a name for yourself, it might as well be with the biggest guns. But let's not romanticize this too much. The reality was that artillery was the least glamorous and the most technical of military branches, perfect for a young man who preferred calculations over courtly dances. Despite his academic prowess, Napoleon wasn't exactly a social butterfly. He was more like a social porcupine, bristling with ambition and impatience. His time at the École Militaire coincided with the death of his father, which left his family in financial ruin and pushed Napoleon to finish his studies quickly so he could support them. He graduated in 1785, second in his class, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment. Not bad for a kid from Corsica who spoke French with an accent thicker than a Parisian fog. Now, here's where things start to get spicy. Napoleon's early military career was a mix of brilliant strategy and, let's be honest, making enemies with a finesse that would make a reality TV star look like a diplomat. His postings took him all over France, from the sleepy town of Valence to the more bustling Auxerre. In Valence, Napoleon continued his self-education, garbling up books on everything from philosophy to science. His reading list was more diverse than a modern-day college syllabus and included works by Rousseau, Voltaire, and Plutarch. But don't let the image of a studious, quiet officer fool you. Napoleon had a knack for polarizing people. He was intensely critical of superiors and wasn't shy about voicing his opinions, which, unsurprisingly, didn't win him many friends. Yet, his strategic mind and daring ideas made him a standout soldier. He was like a chess player who saw the board 3 moves ahead, while everyone else was still figuring out how the horsey piece moved. Napoleon's rise wasn't all smooth sailing. The French Revolution was brewing, and the country was a powder keg ready to explode. As the monarchy crumbled in 1789, Napoleon saw an opportunity, not just for France, but for himself. He returned to Corsica to get involved in local politics, aligning himself with the Corsican nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli. But as alliances go, this one was about as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. By 1793, Napoleon's relationship with Paoli soured, leading to a series of events that forced him and his family to flee Corsica. This expulsion was a turning point, as it cut the last threads of his Corsican identity and tied his fate irrevocably to France. Napoleon's knack for making enemies had once again reshaped his path, pushing him toward the mainland and the turbulent opportunities of revolutionary France. And let's talk about those opportunities. The revolution was a chaotic time, but for a sharp-witted, ambitious officer like Napoleon, it was a gold mine. The political upheaval meant promotions were based on merit rather than birthright, which suited our young artillery officer just fine. Napoleon's big break came during the siege of Toulon in 1793, where he devised a plan that led to a decisive French victory. His reward, a promotion to brigadier general at the tender age of 24. Not too shabby for a guy who once got picked on for his Corsican accent. Napoleon's early years were a whirlwind of ambition, strategy, and the occasional schoolboy prank that hinted at his future as a master tactician. He was a paradox, a Corsican who became the embodiment of French military genius, a man of the Enlightenment who would one day crown himself emperor. His path from the wilds of Corsica to the heart of French power was paved with the books he devoured, the enemies he made, and the strategic brilliance that would soon change the course of history. So, from a Corsican kid with a hefty chip on his shoulder to a brigadier general at 24, Napoleon was now poised to take Europe by storm. And we're better to start than Italy. We're talking about a place with more city-states than a Game of Thrones map and ripe for the picking in 1796. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who could turn a ragtag army into a well-oiled conquering machine faster than you can say, "Vive la France." The Italian campaign was Napoleon's playground, and he was ready to show off his toys, innovative tactics, and a mind for logistics that made others look like they were still playing checkers. Napoleon inherited the ragtag army of Italy, a group so starved and underfunded that calling them an army was charitable. But Napoleon had something more potent than gold, charisma, and a knack for inspiration. He promised his men honor, glory, and riches, which is a pretty sweet deal when you're living on shoe leather and stale bread. Now, here's the thing about Napoleon's strategies. They were as groundbreaking as a new iPhone. Take divide and conquer, for instance. Before Napoleon, armies would confront each other like two sumo wrestlers, belly to belly. Napoleon, with all the audacity of a startup disruptor, decided to break the mold. He'd split his forces into smaller, more flexible units capable of moving with the speed and precision of a ballet dancer on Red Bull. By isolating sections of his enemy, Napoleon could engage them piecemeal with overwhelming force, essentially turning his opponents into a series of dominoes and giving them a polite shove. The Italian campaign was a series of masterclasses in these tactics. It began with the Battle of Montagnard in April 1796, where Napoleon's forces outmaneuvered and defeated the Piedmontese army. In just 2 weeks, the French had racked up enough victories to force the Kingdom of Sardinia to sue for peace. Napoleon was like a kid in a candy store, except this candy store was full of territorial concessions and war loot. The Treaty of Cherasco was signed on May 15, 1796, and Napoleon could now focus on his next target, the Austrians. Let's talk about the march of the French army. Under Napoleon's command, they moved with a speed that would make modern logistics companies weep. In a world where marching 10 miles a day was considered brisk, Napoleon's troops routinely covered 20 miles. They might not have had GPS, but they had something better, a leader who knew the terrain and a sense of urgency that would make a caffeine junkie jittery. Napoleon understood that time was his ally and his enemy's worst nightmare. But let's not sugarcoat it. The speed and daring of Napoleon's maneuvers relied on certain harsh truths. His soldiers lived off the land, which is a romantic way of saying they scavenged like raccoons. It was a brutal necessity that kept them moving, but also left a trail of disgruntled locals. And here's where the myth-busting comes in. Napoleon wasn't always the benevolent liberator he's often painted as. Occupation came with its share of looting, and the locals weren't exactly throwing parades. Victory after victory, Napoleon's campaign read like a bestseller. Each battle a new chapter, each victory a plot twist. There was the Battle of Lodi, where he earned the nickname, the Little Corporal, for leading a daring charge across a bridge under fire. It was a PR masterstroke, the kind of thing that would go viral today, and Napoleon knew it. He was as much a master of self-promotion as he was of strategy. He understood that a good battle narrative could be as potent as a cannonball. Napoleon's ability to turn battlefield success into personal legend was almost as impressive as his military tactics. He had a flair for the dramatic, riding dispatches that would make a Hollywood screenwriter proud. These accounts were sent back to Paris, where they were eagerly devoured by a public hungry for victories and a government that needed a hero. In an era before Instagram, Napoleon's words were his selfies, carefully curated to build his brand. But let's not forget the reality behind the legend. For all his genius, Napoleon's campaigns were taxing in every sense of the word. The soldiers were often unpaid, relying on the spoils of war to keep them going. It was a precarious existence, a high-wire act without a safety net. Yet Napoleon's charisma and unyielding drive kept the show on the road, with the promise of glory and riches just over the next hill. By the time he reached the gates of Mantua, Napoleon had become more than just a general. He was a force of nature. The siege of Mantua was a protracted affair, lasting from June 1796 to February 1797, and it tested every bit of Napoleon's strategic acumen. The Austrians sent multiple relief armies to break the siege, and each time Napoleon defeated them in a series of battles that combined cunning and sheer audacity. It was a seesaw of momentum, the kind of drama that kept everyone on the edge of their seats. Finally, in February 1797, with the Austrians exhausted and the garrison starving, Mantua fell. Napoleon had not only secured northern Italy, but also cemented his reputation as a military genius. His Italian campaign was a turning point, a moment when he transformed from that short guy to that short conqueror. But even as the legend of Napoleon grew, the reality was that his ambitions were just getting started. He had tasted power and liked it, and the world would soon feel the full weight of his ambitions. And so, as Napoleon prepared to write the next chapter of his story, one thing was clear: he was just getting started. The Italian campaign had been his proving ground, a place where he honed his skills and tasted the heady brew of victory and fame. But for Napoleon, Italy was just the beginning. With Europe looking on in a mix of admiration and trepidation, Napoleon was ready to take his next step on the world stage. The stakes were higher, the challenges greater, and the rewards richer. And Napoleon, ever the gambler, was ready to roll the dice once more. From conquering the lush hills of Italy to setting his sights on the sun-drenched sands of Egypt, Napoleon Bonaparte was ready for his next adventure. If Italy was his debut album, Egypt was his experimental concept project, a mix of military ambition and a dash of archaeology. Picture Napoleon, less a general and more a curious explorer, standing before the pyramids and wondering if he could somehow commandeer them into his army. After all, if you're going to test your skills, why not do it with a backdrop that screams mystery and grandeur? In 1798, Napoleon embarked on the Egyptian campaign, a venture that was part military conquest and part intellectual expedition. The French were keen to disrupt British trade routes to India, and what better way to do that than by seizing Egypt, the crossroads of ancient and modern commerce. Napoleon had a knack for turning war into a multi-purpose endeavor, and this time he brought along a team of savants, the creme de la creme of French intellectual society. These were not your average army engineers. They were scientists, artists, and scholars. It was like packing a TED conference into a military campaign, only with more cannons and fewer PowerPoint presentations. At the heart of this expedition was Napoleon's fascination with Egyptian culture. He was intrigued by the idea of deciphering hieroglyphs and unlocking the secrets of this ancient civilization. But let's not kid ourselves. Napoleon wasn't just in it for the hieroglyphs. He had a strategic mind that saw Egypt as a stepping stone to greater things, like giving the British Empire a bit of heartburn and potentially reaching the riches of the East. Landing in Alexandria in July 1798, Napoleon wasted no time in making a grand entrance. Unfortunately, grand entrances often come with their own set of complications. The Egyptian heat was brutal, the supplies were scarce, and the locals weren't exactly rolling out the red carpet. Yet, Napoleon marched on with his usual flair and audacity. He managed to secure Cairo after the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21, 1798, where his troops faced off against the Mamluks, the ruling military class of Egypt. It was a decisive victory, one that showcased Napoleon's tactical genius once again. His soldiers formed massive squares, a geometric marvel that repelled cavalry charges, proving that sometimes the best defense really is a good square. But while Napoleon was busy playing Pharaoh, a certain British admiral named Horatio Nelson was plotting to crash the party. It seems Nelson wasn't too keen on letting Napoleon have his Mediterranean holiday unchallenged. Enter the Battle of the Nile on August 1, 1798, a naval clash that would become as infamous as it was decisive. The French fleet, anchored in Aboukir Bay, was caught off guard by Nelson's night attack. By the time the sun rose, the French Mediterranean fleet was in shambles. Nelson had pulled off what could only be described as a maritime heist, and Napoleon's dreams of an Eastern empire suddenly looked as stable as a sandcastle at high tide. The loss of the fleet was a colossal blow. Without naval support, Napoleon's Egyptian odyssey turned from a possible gateway to Asia into an isolated escapade. His army was stranded, caught between the desert and the sea with no easy way home. But here's the thing about Napoleon. He thrived on adversity. With his typical bravado, he decided to make the most of his Egyptian sojourn. What else could you do when surrounded by pyramids and sphinxes? Napoleon's time in Egypt wasn't all doom and gloom. His team of savants got busy, and soon the French were cataloguing Egypt's antiquities like kids in a candy store. They mapped the Nile, studied the flora and fauna, and even stumbled upon the Rosetta Stone, a discovery that would eventually unlock the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's almost as if Napoleon had accidentally launched one of the most important archaeological expeditions in history while trying to outmaneuver the Brits. Talk about a happy accident. Despite the intellectual triumphs, life in Egypt wasn't easy. The French soldiers, unaccustomed to the harsh climate, battled not only the enemy, but also disease and scarcity. Napoleon's grand plans were constantly at odds with the grim realities of desert warfare. The dream of liberating Egypt from the Mamluks turned into a prolonged campaign that tested the limits of endurance and logistics. Napoleon was no stranger to hardship, but even he couldn't conjure water from the sand or food from the air. The Egyptian campaign, like all of Napoleon's exploits, was a blend of triumph and trial. It was a testament to his ambition and audacity, as well as a reminder of the limits of even the greatest military minds. For every victory like the Battle of the Pyramids, there was a setback like the Battle of the Nile. The campaign was a complex tapestry of conquest and culture, with Napoleon at its center, forever striving to turn the tides of fate in his favor. But as the sands of Egypt sifted through his fingers, Napoleon began to sense that his time in the land of the pharaohs was drawing to a close. The winds of destiny were calling him back to Europe, where the political landscape was shifting and new opportunities were arising. Before long, Napoleon would leave Egypt behind, a land of ancient mysteries and modern frustrations, to return to a continent on the brink of further upheaval. For now, Napoleon had to contend with the realities of his Egyptian adventure, a venture that had promised much and delivered a mixed bag of wonders and woes. The pyramids, after all, had stood for millennia before him, and would continue to do so long after his departure. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign was a chapter in a larger story, one that would see him rise to even greater heights and face even more formidable challenges. But that, as they say, is a tale for another day. Napoleon Bonaparte, freshly dusting off the sands of Egypt, returned to a Europe that was as volatile as a chemistry lab experiment gone awry. In 1799, he staged a little coup d'etat, the kind that even reality TV producers would envy, and crowned himself First Consul of France. Imagine a political power move that made chess players look indecisive. With this new title came a Europe-sized to-do list, and Napoleon, ever the multitasker, was ready to tackle it with the same gusto he brought to everything, from war to, presumably, breakfast. Now, if you thought Napoleon's earlier antics were audacious, his Napoleonic wars were about to crank up the volume. Europe's monarchs viewed him with a mix of fear and fascination, like a circus performer juggling flaming torches. The man had ambitions that were only rivaled by his penchant for collecting fancy hats, and his European tour de force was about to start with the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, a strategic magnum opus that would secure his place in the military Hall of Fame. Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, was like a heavyweight championship match in the middle of nowhere, specifically the rolling hills of the modern-day Czech Republic. Napoleon versus Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Holy Roman Emperor Francis Roman II. Napoleon's army, around 68,000 strong, faced a coalition force of roughly 87,000. The odds weren't great, but Napoleon had a knack for turning underdog moments into stunning victories. He was like the Rocky Balboa of military strategy. The plan was a classic feint, a tactical sleight of hand that made Houdini look like an amateur. Napoleon intentionally weakened his right flank, luring the Allies into thinking they had the upper hand. As the coalition forces overextended themselves, Napoleon counterattacked with precision, exploiting the very overconfidence he had orchestrated. By the end of the day, the Allies were shattered, losing over 36,000 men compared to Napoleon's 9,000. Austerlitz wasn't just a victory, it was a masterpiece. Napoleon had painted a picture of tactical brilliance with the broad strokes of deception and the fine brush of timing. But let's not get too starry-eyed with Napoleonic genius. War, as always, was a brutal business, and Austerlitz was no exception. The battlefield was littered with the grim detritus of broken lives and shattered dreams, a stark reminder that glory often came at a price paid in blood and suffering. Napoleon's dispatches, however, glossed over these harsh realities with the flair of a seasoned PR manager, crafting a narrative of inevitable triumph that played well in the salons of Paris. In the afterglow of Austerlitz, Napoleon's ambition only grew. He was like a kid in a candy store, except the candy was, entire countries. His next big move was the continental system, an economic blockade against Britain designed to strangle the island nation economically. The idea was simple. If you can't beat them on water, beat them in the marketplace. Napoleon declared Europe off-limits to British goods, a bold plan with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The continental system, though ingenious in theory, was as leaky as a colander. Smugglers thrived, and European economies, already teetering on the edge, started feeling the pinch. The blockade hit many of Napoleon's allies harder than it did the British, leading to grumbling that was louder than a Parisian cafe at midday. Portugal outright refused to comply, prompting Napoleon to launch the Peninsular War, a military misadventure that was about as successful as a chocolate fireguard. The Peninsular War, fought on the Iberian Peninsula from 1807 to 1814, was a quagmire of guerrilla warfare and strategic blunders. Spain and Portugal, aided by the British, turned the region into a meat grinder for French ambitions. It was here that Napoleon's decision-making proved as unpredictable as a weather app, with forecasts of victory often turning into storms of defeat. The Spanish resistance was fierce, fueled by nationalism and led by gritty generals like the Duke of Wellington, who seemed to have an uncanny knack for spoiling Napoleon's plans. The war drained French resources and morale, becoming a lingering headache that even Napoleon couldn't shake. It was the kind of protracted conflict that sapped strength and tested patience, a reminder that not all battles could be won with a decisive stroke. The Peninsular War was like that one pesky fly at a picnic, annoying, persistent, and a harbinger of more trouble to come. Meanwhile, back in the heart of Europe, Napoleon's map-redrawing antics continued. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, declaring himself protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, a fancy title that essentially meant, "I call the shots here now." His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Russian border, a patchwork quilt of puppet states and wary allies, all stitched together with the thread of French dominance. But for all his conquests, Napoleon was playing a dangerous game of geopolitical Jenga, and the tower was starting to wobble. The continental system's economic fallout was a testament to the law of unintended consequences. While Britain's economy managed to weather the storm, the blockade hurt French allies more than their intended target. Trade routes were disrupted, goods became scarce, and discontent simmered like a pot about to boil over. Napoleon, in his quest to bring Britain to its knees, found himself increasingly isolated, a titan whose reach was starting to exceed his grasp. As the Napoleonic Wars raged on, the reality of empire weighed heavily on its creator. The cost of maintaining control over such vast territories was immense, both in terms of resources and human lives. Napoleon's grand vision of a united Europe under French hegemony was as fragile as it was ambitious, a dream that required constant vigilance and occasional brute force to sustain. The myth of Napoleon as an invincible leader was beginning to crack, revealing the human beneath the legend. For every Austerlitz, there was a peninsular war, each victory tempered by the knowledge that defeat was never far behind. The challenges of governing an empire were as daunting as the conquests that had built it, a reminder that the burdens of power were as heavy as the laurels of victory. But for now, Napoleon remained undeterred, a man whose ambitions were as vast as the empire he had carved out of Europe's heart. The Napoleonic Wars were far from over, and the stage was set for new battles, new alliances, and new chapters in a saga that would shape the continent for generations to come. As the drums of war beat on, Napoleon marched forward, driven by dreams of glory and the relentless tide of history that he himself had set in motion. Napoleon's relentless pursuit of glory was about to meet its match, a little place called Waterloo, a name that would soon become shorthand for epic failure. Fast forward to June 18, 1815, where Napoleon stood on a muddy Belgian field, facing the combined might of the Seventh Coalition, led by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberet von Blücher. This wasn't just a battle. It was the grand finale of a career that had soared to dizzying heights and was now careening towards a dramatic crash. The numbers tell a story of their own. Napoleon commanded around 73,000 troops, while the Allies had roughly 118,000. It was like trying to win a chess match with fewer pieces than your opponent, and Napoleon was gambling on his usual flair for strategy to tip the scales. But here's the twist. Luck, that fickle mistress, decided she'd had enough of Napoleon's advances. The ground was wet, delaying his attack and giving Wellington precious time to dig in. By the time Napoleon launched his assault, it was like trying to run a marathon in quicksand. Napoleon's strategy was classic Napoleon: attack the center, break through, and roll up the flanks. But Wellington was no rookie. He had fortified his positions with an elegance that would make a game of Risk look like child's play. The battle raged for hours, a brutal ballet of bayonets and cannon fire, with each side trading blows like heavyweight boxers. By mid-afternoon, it looked like the French might pull it off, but then Blücher's Prussian forces arrived, turning the tide against Napoleon. It was the cavalry charge that never ended, and it left the French on their heels and Napoleon with a sinking feeling that no amount of charisma could fix. By the time the dust settled, the battlefield was a scene of devastation, littered with thousands of casualties, a grim testament to the cost of ambition. Napoleon's forces were shattered, losing around 25 22,000 men compared to the Allies' 22,000. But the numbers alone don't capture the finality of it all. Waterloo wasn't just a defeat, it was the demise of an era, the curtain call for a man who had seen himself as the master of Europe. With his army in tatters and his empire crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a wave, Napoleon did what any self-respecting fallen emperor would do. He abdicated again. On June 22, 1815, he handed over power to his son, though it was more ceremonial than practical. The Allies weren't about to let France play Emperor swap, and Napoleon found himself once more on the wrong end of exile. This time, however, the destination was a little less glamorous than Elba. Forget the Mediterranean island retreat. The British had a different location in mind. St. Helena, a remote rock in the South Atlantic, about as far from the action as you could get. Before we get to St. Helena, let's rewind to the brief interlude on Elba, Napoleon's previous exile destination, where he was sent in 1814 after his first abdication. Imagine it as a sort of forced semi-retirement, complete with the title of Emperor of Elba, a grandiose label for an island that was more rock than resort. Napoleon, never one to sit idle, set about reforming the island's administration and even made plans for economic development. But let's be real, managing Elba was like asking an Olympic sprinter to run on a treadmill. It just wasn't going to keep him satisfied for long. Napoleon's escape from Elba in February 1815 was the stuff of legend, a daring return to France that saw him march from the coast to Paris, gathering support like a snowball rolling downhill. By March 20, he was back in the capital, and the 100 Days began, a brief, audacious attempt to reclaim his throne and restore his empire. But those 100 days were like a high-stakes poker game, with Napoleon betting everything on a final hand that came up short at Waterloo. And so, the British, having learned their lesson, decided that St. Helena would be the final chapter in Napoleon's saga. It was a place as isolated as a hermit in a cave, and the British took no chances, surrounding the island with a naval blockade and keeping a watchful eye on their infamous prisoner. Napoleon arrived there in October 1850, and the island became both his prison and his stage, where he would spend his final years writing his memoirs and reflecting on a life lived at full throttle. St. Helena was no Corsican coast or lush Italian landscape. It was a barren, windswept outpost, more suited for solitary reflection than grand strategy. Yet even in exile, Napoleon's charisma and intellect remained undimmed. He dictated his thoughts on military tactics, governance, and history, crafting a narrative that would shape his legacy as much as his battles had. His health, however, deteriorated in the island's humid climate, and he was plagued by stomach ailments that would eventually claim his life. Napoleon's death on May 5, 1821, marked the end of an era. He left behind a Europe reshaped by his ambition, a continent where the echoes of his wars would resonate for decades. His legacy is a complex tapestry, part military genius, part tyrant, part reformer. He was a man who could inspire loyalty in his troops and fear in his enemies, a leader whose vision of empire both united and fractured Europe. The myth of Napoleon endures, a testament to a figure who defied the odds and redrew the map of Europe. He left behind a legal code, the Napoleonic Code, which influenced legal systems across the world, and an enduring fascination with his life and exploits. Yet, for all his accomplishments, Napoleon's story is also a cautionary tale of hubris and the perils of unchecked ambition. His rise and fall serve as a reminder that even the greatest leaders are bound by the limitations of their own humanity. In the end, Napoleon's legacy is as towering as his stature was modest, a testament to a man who, despite a supposed height complex, stood taller than most in the annals of history. His life was a whirlwind of battles and politics, triumphs and defeats, a saga that continues to captivate and confound. Whether viewed as a hero or a villain, a visionary or a tyrant, Napoleon Bonaparte remains a figure whose impact is as undeniable as it is enduring. And like all great stories, his is one that invites us to reflect on the nature of power, ambition, and the relentless march of history. The island of Crete, around 2700 BCE, was the place to be if you were into advanced civilization. not just because of its strategic location smack in the middle of the Mediterranean. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a prime beachfront property, but because the Minoans knew how to party like it was the Bronze Age. And by party, I mean they masterminded some seriously groundbreaking urban planning. You know that feeling when you finally figure out how to organize your desk so it doesn't look like a paper tornado hit it? The Minoans basically did that on a massive scale. Let's talk Knossos, the crown jewel of Minoan civilization. This wasn't just any old settlement. It was a thriving metropolis with multi-story buildings that would put any modern condo complex to shame. We're talking structures that soared up to 5 stories. And get this, they had indoor plumbing. Yes, while the rest of the world was still figuring out how not to trip over their own sandals, the Minoans were enjoying what could only be described as the ancient equivalent of a luxurious spa day. Running water, flushing toilets, the whole shebang. They were living the high life, quite literally. Now, you might be thinking, surely, with all this sophistication, the Minoans must have had their heads stuck in the clouds. Not quite. They were practical folks, too, and their urban planning wasn't just about aesthetics or comfort. It was about efficiency and trade. Knossos was the epicenter of a vast trade network that stretched across the Aegean and beyond. These guys were the Jeff Bezoses of the Bronze Age, except instead of 2-day shipping, you got goods from Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant after a solid few months at sea. But hey, it was a start. Speaking of trade, the Minoans were linguistic pioneers as well. They developed a script known as Linear, and while it remains as indecipherable as a toddler's doodles to modern historians, it clearly demonstrates their complex administrative systems. Linear was the ancient equivalent of an Excel spreadsheet, keeping track of goods, transactions, and possibly even the best places to snag a good olive oil deal. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of it all. When people hear Minoans, their minds often drift to the labyrinth and the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature that sounds like it stumbled out of a poorly executed sci-fi flick. The myth, as enchanting as it is, was spun by later Greeks who couldn't resist a good story, while the Minoans did have a penchant for bulls, evidenced by their bull-leaping frescoes and the fact that they probably sacrificed a few for religious purposes. There's zero archaeological evidence to suggest they were hiding a genetically confused monster in their basements. What they did have, however, were real, tangible achievements that set the stage for future Greek civilizations. Their influence was like that of a wise, albeit slightly eccentric, older sibling, showing baby Greece how to manage resources, engage in trade, and perhaps most importantly, how to build a society that could withstand the whims of nature and time. Knossos and other Minoan sites were designed with resilience in mind, not just for the wow factor. They knew how to handle earthquakes, for example, with foundations that absorbed shock better than most modern mattresses. In the grand scheme of history, the Minoan civilization wasn't just a flash in the pan. They were laying down the blueprints for what would become one of the most iconic cultures in history. They were the unsung influencers of the ancient world, and their legacy, like a good plumbing system, has stood the test of time. And speaking of legacies that flow like a well-designed sewage system, let's plunge into the economic currents that made the Minoan civilization the Wall Street of the Bronze Age. Picture this. The Aegean Sea wasn't just a picturesque backdrop for sunset selfies. It was more like a superhighway for trade, bustling with ships laden with goods rather than tourists armed with selfie sticks. The Minoans, ever the savvy entrepreneurs, were right at the heart of this mercantile frenzy, their ships slicing through the waters like well-sharpened knives through feeder cheese. Now, what really set the Minoans apart in the economic world was their knack for luxury items. These weren't your average trinkets, but high-end goods that made the elites of other civilizations sigh with longing. Take their pottery, for example. We're not talking about your grandma's flower pots. This was pottery that could rival a Gucci handbag in terms of desirability. Their vases, with intricate designs and vivid colors, became the must-have items across the Mediterranean. They were the ancient influencers, setting trends that everyone from Mycenaeans to Egyptians wanted to follow. But pottery wasn't the only item on their high-end catalog. The Minoans were also metallurgical maestros, crafting exquisite items from bronze and gold that were the bling of the ancient world. Their metalwork was so impressive that even the pharaohs of Egypt took notice. and probably wished they could order a few pieces online with free shipping. These luxury exports were the backbone of the Minoans' wealth and power, allowing them to build an economy as robust as their plumbing system. Their influence didn't stop at trade goods. Picture the art scene in ancient Greece before the Minoan touch. Basic, effective, but nothing to write home about. Enter the Minoans, who splashed their lively styles and vibrant frescoes across Greek canvases like Jackson Pollock on a particularly energetic day. Their art was as lively as a Saturday night in Knossos, full of color and movement. Greek artisans, never ones to shy away from a good idea, started incorporating Minoan motifs into their own work. The swirling patterns, the naturalistic themes, and even the infamous bull-leaping scenes made their way into Greek ceramic and fresco designs, leaving a lasting mark that was as indelible as a tattoo. But let's not romanticize this into a tale of peaceful cultural exchange over herbal tea and honey cakes. While the Minoans were undeniably influential, they weren't exactly hosting all-night peace parties with their neighbors. Archaeological digs have unearthed the kind of evidence that would make a conspiracy theorist's heart skip a beat. Defensive structures, such as fortified walls and watchtowers, suggest that the Minoans were well aware of the not-so-friendly intentions of those around them. It turns out that even in paradise, you occasionally need a good, sturdy fence. And then there are the weapons. Yes, the Minoans, with all their sophistication, weren't averse to a little swordplay. Swords, daggers, and other offensive tools have been found among their ruins, hinting that they might have had to defend their luxurious lifestyle more than a few times. So much for the utopian image of a civilization that preferred dancing to fighting. So, were the Minoans a peaceful, trade-loving society, or a shrewd, occasionally defensive powerhouse? The answer, much like a good Greek salad, is a mix of both. They were complex, multifaceted, and ultimately human, capable of both creation and conflict, beauty and brutality. It's this intricate dance of diplomacy and defense, artistry and aggression, that makes the Minoan civilization not just a footnote in the annals of history, but a chapter worth revisiting, time and again. As we sail forward in this journey through time, we'll continue to unravel the story of how the Minoans left their indelible mark on the world, influencing not only the Greeks, but also the course of history as we know it. But rest assured, this isn't the end of our voyage just yet. There's more to discover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to uncover about this enigmatic civilization that once ruled the waves of the Aegean. Stay tuned, because the Minoans have a few more secrets up their sleeves, or should we say, their togas. As we journey further into the labyrinth of Minoan culture, let's take a detour from the architectural marvels and economic triumphs to explore the spiritual heart of this civilization. The Minoans were not just trading moguls with an eye for pottery. They were also fervent worshippers, with a penchant for rituals that would make even the most enthusiastic yoga retreat seem tame. At the core of their religious practices was a profound reverence for the great goddess, a deity who seems to have been the Beyoncé of the Bronze Age, powerful, omnipresent, and the subject of many a fresco. It's no surprise that the Minoans, like many ancient cultures, bowed to the divine feminine. With a society so closely tied to the cycles of nature, it makes sense they'd celebrate a goddess who symbolized fertility, life, and renewal. The Minoans left behind a treasure trove of artifacts depicting this goddess, often with snakes coiled around her arms, a symbol of rebirth and transformation. We can almost hear the ancient chants echoing through the halls of Knossos as they performed their rituals, perhaps seeking the goddess's favor for a bountiful harvest or safe passage for their trading vessels. Now, if you're wondering how this connects to the Greeks, it's time to play a game I like to call Spot the Influence. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find Greek mythology brimming with powerful female deities, Aphrodite, Demeter, and Artemis, to name a few. Coincidence? I think not. While the Greeks certainly put their own spin on these goddesses, the echoes of Minoan worship are hard to ignore. It's like seeing the shadow of an older sibling in the younger one's accomplishments, familiar yet distinct. And then, of course, there's bull leaping. Ah, the good old days when entertainment didn't involve Netflix, but rather a hearty dose of adrenaline and a healthy disregard for safety. Minoan bull leaping was part ritual, part sport, and all spectacle. Picture this: an arena filled with spectators, a bull charging forward, and a remarkably brave, some might say reckless, individual vaulting over its back with the grace of an Olympic gymnast. The bull wasn't just a source of entertainment, though. It was a sacred animal, integral to Minoan religious iconography. While the Greeks might not have kept up the acrobatics over bulls, they did carry forward the symbolism. The bull appears in Greek myths, most famously the Minotaur, hinting at the enduring fascination with these powerful creatures. It's as if the Greeks took the Minoan bull and dressed it in the drama of their myths, adding layers of narrative intrigue. But let's not forget the visual feast that was Minoan art. Unlike the static, stoic sculptures of later Greek art, the Minoans preferred a more dynamic approach. Their frescoes are alive with vibrant colors and naturalistic themes, dolphins dancing through waves, lively scenes of bustling marketplaces, and of course, those famous bull leapers. The Minoans painted a world teeming with life, in stark contrast to the more restrained palettes of their contemporaries. This love of color and movement wasn't lost on the Greeks. As they developed their own artistic style, the echoes of Minoan influence were unmistakable. Greek art, particularly during the Archaic period, borrowed heavily from those vibrant Minoan frescoes. It's like they found that one filter on Instagram that makes everything pop, and couldn't resist using it over and over. Now, before we get too caught up in the romance of cultural diffusion, let's take a step back and ask, was it really all peace, love, and artistic exchange over a cup of wine? The narrative of cultural diffusion is seductive, but history rarely offers such clean lines. While it's tempting to see the Minoans as gentle influencers who passed on their wisdom to the Greeks, the reality might have been more complex. Direct influence or a case of parallel development? Perhaps a bit of both. With the Minoans' influence waning around 1450 BCE, possibly due to natural disasters or invasions, the Mycenaeans, those rugged mainland Greeks, stepped into the void, adopting and adapting what they found. So, were the Greeks the eager students of Minoan culture, or did they simply pick through the ruins of Knossos like a thrift shopper at a yard sale, finding bits and pieces that suited their evolving tastes? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The Minoans may not have handed over the cultural baton willingly, but their influence is undeniable. It's a testament to the resilience of ideas, that even amidst the collapse of a civilization, the essence of its beliefs, its art, and its rituals can endure, seeping into the fabric of the societies that follow. As we continue to unravel the mysteries of the Minoans, the question remains, just how deep does their influence on Greek culture run? Stay tuned, because we're diving deeper into this ancient saga, where myths merge with history, and the past continues to shape the present. So, as we stand at the precipice of Minoan history, it's time to delve into the murky waters of their mysterious decline. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoans, who'd been living the high life with their multi-story palaces and enviable trade networks, suddenly hit a snag. Theories abound, and if ancient history were a Netflix series, this would be the part where we all start binge-watching to find out what really went down. First off, let's talk natural disasters. The Minoans had the misfortune of residing in a neighborhood with a particularly fiery tenant named Thera, the volcano. When Thera erupted, it wasn't just a bit of ash in the air. It was a cataclysmic event that would make Pompeii look like a minor barbecue mishap. Some estimates suggest the eruption was 4 times more powerful than the infamous Krakatoa blast of 1883. We're talking massive tsunamis, ash clouds that blotted out the sun, and a climate shift that would have sent any Bronze Age weather forecaster into a panic. If Mother Nature ever threw a tantrum, this was it. But wait, there's more. While the Minoans were busy dealing with Mother Nature's wrath, the Mycenaeans, Greece's up-and-coming mainland power, were eyeing Crete like a cat eyes an unattended fish. The Mycenaeans weren't just your average neighbors. They were the kind who borrowed a cup of sugar and then decided to keep your kitchen. Archaeological evidence suggests that after the natural disasters weakened the Minoans, the Mycenaeans moved in, not so much with a friendly hello as with a strategic takeover. Now, let's not paint the Mycenaeans as one-dimensional villains with a taste for conquest. This wasn't a straightforward, hostile takeover. The Mycenaeans were more like savvy business moguls who saw an opportunity and took it. They absorbed and adapted Minoan culture, creating a fascinating hybrid that was uniquely their own. The Mycenaeans borrowed heavily from Minoan art, architecture, and even their economic practices. It's like they took the Minoan blueprint added a few of their own tweaks, and started their own cultural startup. Archaeological digs reveal evidence of a complex relationship between these two civilizations. We're talking shared technologies, trade networks, and even religious practices. The Mycenaeans adopted Linear A, the Minoan script, and modified it into Linear B, a script they've left us scratching our heads over, since it's still partially undeciphered. But here's the kicker. Linear B was used to keep track of economic transactions and administrative details, much like Linear A. This linguistic evolution tells us something crucial. While the Mycenaeans might have been the new kids on the block, they were standing on the shoulders of Minoan giants. So, what's the real story here? Is it a tale of conquest, or is it more of a cultural merger? The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Mycenaeans didn't just wipe out the Minoans. They integrated their achievements and built upon them. It's a testament to the resilience and adaptability of both cultures, and it highlights the messy, complicated nature of historical change. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. The transition from Minoan to Mycenaean dominance wasn't just a change in who was in charge. It was a shift in the entire cultural landscape of the Aegean. The Mycenaeans, with their newfound Minoan-inspired flair, became the dominant power in Greece. Their influence extended far beyond the shores of Crete, shaping the course of Greek history for centuries to come. And here's where it gets even juicier. The Mycenaean civilization, with its roots in Minoan culture, set the stage for what would eventually become classical Greece. The art, architecture, and mythology that we associate with ancient Greece have deep roots in this fascinating hybrid culture. It's like watching a game of cultural telephone, where each civilization adds its own twist to the story. But let's not get too romantic about this cultural fusion. The reality was far from idyllic. The Mycenaeans, much like the Minoans before them, weren't immune to the whims of fate. Around 1200 BCE, they too faced their own decline, possibly due to similar factors that felled the Minoans: natural disasters, invasions, and internal strife. It's a reminder that history, much like life, is unpredictable and often downright messy. As we ponder the decline of the Minoans and the rise of the Mycenaeans, we're left with more questions than answers. How much of Minoan culture truly survived in Mycenaean Greece? Was it a case of cultural continuity or a dramatic shift? And what does this tell us about the nature of civilizations and their legacies? One thing's for sure. The story of the Minoans and Mycenaeans is a rich tapestry of human endeavor, innovation, and adaptation. It's a testament to the fact that while civilizations may rise and fall, their impact resonates through history, shaping the world in ways both profound and unexpected. And as we move forward in our exploration of ancient Greece, we'll continue to unravel the intricate threads of this historical saga. There's more to discover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to uncover about the civilizations that once ruled the waves of the Aegean. So, stay tuned, because the past has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. As we delve deeper into the tapestry of the Minoan legacy, we find ourselves contemplating the intricate ways in which they laid the groundwork for the Greeks' golden age. It's a bit like realizing that the blueprint for your favorite modern skyscraper was actually sketched out by a master architect centuries ago, complete with all the bells and whistles, indoor plumbing and all. First, let's talk architecture. The Minoans were basically the ancient world's version of architectural trendsetters, setting the stage for Greek innovations with their multi-story palaces and advanced urban designs. If you thought the Acropolis was impressive, remember that its conceptual ancestors were the sprawling complexes of Knossos and Phaistos. These palaces weren't just fancy digs. They were designed with a keen eye for earthquake resistance and efficient living. The Minoans didn't just build structures. They crafted spaces that balanced utility with aesthetics, a lesson the Greeks took to heart and built upon with their own iconic columns and temples. And then there's art. The Minoan aesthetic wasn't about static depictions. It was a celebration of life in all its vibrant chaos. Their frescoes are alive, bursting with movement and color, capturing the vitality of their world. When the Greeks looked to these vibrant works, they saw not just images, but an invitation to explore dynamism and naturalism in their own artistic endeavors. The transition from the rigidity of earlier Greek art to the fluidity seen in the classical period owes much to these Minoan influences. The Greeks took the Minoan playbook and ran with it, creating art that would come to define Western aesthetics for millennia. But let's not forget trade, the lifeblood of any civilization worth its salt. The Minoans were masters of the Mediterranean seas, their trade networks sprawling like a well-woven tapestry. They were the original economic innovators, setting up shop across the Aegean and beyond, exchanging everything from pottery to precious metals. The Greeks, ever the astute students, took these lessons in mercantilism and expanded them, eventually dominating the ancient world's trade routes. The Minoans had shown them the ropes, and the Greeks sailed those ropes straight into the annals of history. As we reflect on these contributions, it's hard to ignore the romantic allure of the Minoans. From the tales of the labyrinth to the frescoes of bull leapers, they occupy a special place in our collective imagination. Yet, it wasn't until Sir Arthur Evans took a shovel to Crete in the early 20th century that the Minoans truly leapt from myth into reality. Evans, with his penchant for grand narratives, unearthed Knossos, and in doing so, rekindled the world's fascination with this enigmatic civilization. However, his interpretations were sometimes more fantasy than fact, as he occasionally let his enthusiasm paint a picture as colorful as a Minoan fresco. He saw what he wanted to see, a peaceful matriarchal society. And while there's some truth to that vision, the reality was, as always, more complex. Through Evans' lens, the Minoans became the poster children for a utopian past, one where art and peace reigned supreme. Yet, archaeological evidence tells us they were also warriors when necessary, not immune to the era's conflicts and power struggles. So, while the romance of Evans' narratives captivates us, we must remain vigilant, separating the wheat of archaeological fact from the chaff of imaginative interpretation. In modern media, the Minoans continue to dance between history and myth, captivating audiences with tales of their grandeur and mystery. Whether it's in documentaries, novels, or even video games, they are portrayed as both a lost utopia and a society shrouded in intrigue. It's a testament to their enduring allure, but also a reminder of the importance of approaching history with a critical eye. We must appreciate the beauty of the myths while anchoring our understanding in the bedrock of fact. The legacy of the Minoans is a reminder of the cyclical nature of history. Civilizations rise, fall, and leave echoes that resonate through time. The Greeks, who stood on the shoulders of these Cretan giants, would in turn become the bedrock for Roman and later Western culture. It's a grand relay race, where the baton is passed from one civilization to the next, each one adding its own flourish before handing it off. The Minoans may not have left us with their language or a comprehensive written history, but their influence is woven into the very fabric of Western civilization. As we conclude this odyssey through Minoan history, we're left with a tapestry rich in color, complexity, and contradiction. The Minoans were both sophisticated and savage, peaceful and prepared for war, artists and architects. They were a civilization of contrasts, and it's these very contrasts that make their story so compelling. They remind us that history is not a single narrative, but a mosaic of stories, each piece contributing to the larger picture. So, as we close the chapter on the Minoans, let's carry forward the lesson of their legacy, that the past is not a distant land, but a mirror reflecting the complexities of our own world. In understanding where we come from, we gain insight into where we are headed. And with that, the Minoans continue to speak to us, not just as echoes from a distant past, but as vibrant voices in the ongoing dialogue of human history. You're waking up in the year 1348, and let's be honest, things are looking a bit grim. The sun is barely peeking over the horizon, casting a dull light on a city that feels more like the opening scene of an apocalyptic movie than a bustling hub of medieval life. You might think you're about to spend the day dodging horse-drawn carts and haggling over the price of a new tunic. But nope, your biggest concern is a little something called the Black Death. Yes, the bubonic plague has crashed Europe's party, and it's not leaving anytime soon. First things first, let's talk about how this little guest arrived at the door. It's 1347, and the Black Death has just sailed into Europe on merchant ships like some horribly twisted gift from the East. Originating in the arid plains of Central Asia, it hitched a ride on the Silk Road, then harped on some Genoese trade ships docking at Messina, Sicily, and just like that, it was off to the races. By the time it reached France, the disease was spreading faster than gossip at a medieval market. Now, numbers don't lie, and here's one for you. The Black Death wiped out an estimated 30–60% of Europe's population. That's around 25 million people, give or take a few thousand poor souls. In some places, entire villages were erased like a bad memory. To put it in perspective, if you're living in a town of 100, it's possible that only 40 of you will be around to see the next harvest. Cheery, right? As you amble through narrow streets that might once have been bustling with vendors shouting about their freshest fish or finest wool, you can't help but notice the eerie silence. The Black Death has a way of quieting down the usual hustle and bustle, replacing laughter and haggling with the distant toll of funeral bells. Now, let's chat about hygiene, because this is where things get both interesting and, frankly, a bit stomach-churning. Contrary to popular belief, medieval folks weren't entirely clueless about cleanliness. They bathed, though not religiously, and they knew enough to throw their chamber parts out the window. Okay, so maybe they weren't winning any awards for sanitation, but they weren't completely hopeless either. Still, they had no concept of germs or bacteria. The idea was that bad smells caused disease, which is why they went around holding aromatic herbs to their noses, hoping that lavender sprig would keep the plague at bay. The initial reactions to the plague's arrival were a mix of blind panic and wild theories. People thought it was a punishment from God, which, let's be honest, is kind of the medieval go-to explanation for anything that goes wrong. Earthquake, God's wrath, crops fail, divine displeasure, bubonic plague. Well, you get the idea. Some folks turned to flagellation, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, hoping to appease the Almighty. Others blamed the stars, because why not? And let's not forget about the scapegoating. As fear spread, so did the finger-pointing. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, a baseless claim that led to horrific violence and persecution. It's a dark reminder that in times of crisis, humanity doesn't always rise to the occasion. Walking past the local tavern, you might hear a whispered tale or two about plague doctors, those eerie figures dressed in long cloaks and beaked masks stuffed with herbs. They were the medieval equivalent of a hazmat suit, designed more for show than actual protection. These guys were supposed to be the experts, yet most of their methods were about as effective as sprinkling glitter on a dumpster fire. Bloodletting, leeches, and potions of dubious origin were all part of the package deal. Despite all the chaos, there's a strange sort of gallows humor that emerges. People start writing plague songs and poetry, because if you can't laugh in the face of death, what's left? It's this dark humor that keeps spirits somewhat buoyed, even as the world feels like it's crumbling. As the day progresses, you can't help but feel the weight of uncertainty. You've heard rumors that the plague doesn't discriminate. It takes the rich and poor alike, leveling the social playing field in the most macabre way possible. Nobles who once dined in luxury are now just as vulnerable as the peasant toiling in the fields. This isn't just a health crisis, it's a societal earthquake. The economic impact is another beast entirely. With so many people gone, labor becomes scarce, and the surviving workers find themselves in a rare position of power, demanding better wages and conditions. It's a workers' market, but don't get too excited. It won't last long. The authorities are quick to clamp down, passing laws to cap wages and restrict movement in a bid to keep the status quo. As the sun sets and you make your way back home, you can't help but feel a mix of dread and resignation. The world you once knew is changing, and there's no going back to the way things were. The plague is a brutal teacher, but one that leaves an indelible mark on history. So there you have it, your day in the life of 14th century Europe, where the Black Death looms over every thought and action. It's a time of fear and uncertainty, but also of resilience and adaptation. And as you tuck yourself in, you can't help but wonder what tomorrow will bring. As you stagger out into those plague-ridden streets for another day of medieval mayhem, it's hard not to notice the eerie quietude of it all. Streets that once bustled with the chatter of merchants and the clatter of horse-drawn carts are now subdued, as if the city itself is holding its breath. And who can blame it? The plague has done a number on the population, leaving behind not just empty homes, but a gaping void in the labor force too. It's like Europe woke up one day and half the workers decided to call in sick, permanently. Now, here's the kicker. While the world is busy falling apart, the economic landscape is doing a bit of a pirouette, and not the graceful kind. With a massive chunk of the working population wiped out, the survivors suddenly find themselves in an unusual predicament. Labor is in short supply, and the few hands left to till the fields or craft the goods are holding all the cards. It's a bit like a medieval worker's jackpot, except instead of cash, you're walking away with the promise of better wages and fewer hours. Picture it, a peasant with leverage. It's practically unheard of. But let's not get too carried away with visions of medieval workers waltzing into their lord's manor and demanding a raise. This is the 14th century, after all, and the powers that be aren't exactly thrilled about their serfs getting ideas above their station. Enter the Statute of Labourers of 1351, a desperate attempt by King Edward Roman III to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Good luck enforcing that, Eddie. It's like trying to stop a river with a sieve. The reality is, with so few people left to do the work, those who remain can pretty much name their price. Supply and demand, baby. And while we're talking numbers, let's throw some stats your way. Before the plague, a skilled craftsman might earn about 3 pence a day. After the plague had its wicked way with the population, wages shot up by as much as 200%. That's right, those same craftsmen could now demand 6, even 9 pence a day. It's like winning the medieval lottery without even buying a ticket. But hey, don't start spending those extra pence just yet. While wages are rising, so are prices, and inflation is here to ruin the party. The cost of everyday goods is going through the roof, driven by the same shortages that are fattening pockets. A loaf of bread, the staple of any medieval diet, could cost you twice what it did before the plague hit. It's a classic case of what the market giveth, the market taketh away. Now, if you're thinking that this sounds suspiciously modern, you're not wrong. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll see similar patterns during labor shortages in various industries. It's a tale as old as time. Fewer workers mean higher wages, but also higher prices. The only difference is that today, we're more likely to blame it on global supply chain issues than divine wrath or planetary alignment. Meanwhile, the feudal system, the bedrock of medieval life, is starting to show cracks under the strain. The Black Death didn't just prune the family tree, it uprooted the whole darn thing. With so many serfs kicking the bucket, lords are struggling to maintain their estates, and some are even forced to sell off land or grant freedoms to keep things running. It's an economic earthquake, and the aftershocks are felt across the continent. In essence, the plague is doing what centuries of peasant revolts couldn't. It's shaking the very foundations of the feudal order. And while all this is happening, there's a certain grim satisfaction in the way nature takes its course. It's like the universe has pressed the reset button on Europe's social structure. Those who might have spent their lives toiling in obscurity suddenly have a shot at upward mobility, albeit under the grimmest of circumstances. There's a hint of poetic justice in the chaos, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's room for change and maybe even a glimmer of hope. But let's not get too sentimental. This is still the 14th century, and life is as harsh as ever. The authorities are scrambling to regain control, throwing laws and decrees at the problem like medieval spaghetti at the wall, hoping something will stick. Spoiler, it doesn't. You can't legislate away a pandemic, and the social fabric is fraying faster than a poorly made tunic. As you dodge another chamber part waterfall, some things never change. You can't help but marvel at the resilience of the human spirit. People are adapting, improvising, and yes, even thriving in the face of calamity. The streets might be quieter and the markets less crowded, but life goes on, stubborn and relentless. So, as you make your way through this plague-ravaged world, take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of it all. The Black Death might be the ultimate party crasher, but it's also a catalyst for change, shaking up the status quo in ways no one could have predicted. The world is shifting, like tectonic plates underfoot, and who knows where the dust will settle. And as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, you can't help but wonder what tomorrow holds. One thing's for sure. In this wacky world of medieval upheaval, there's never a dull moment. As the medieval sun slides down the sky, casting its last fiery glint over the rooftops, you decide it's time to see how the local bigwigs are handling this whole plague situation. Spoiler alert. It's a mix of chaos, confusion, and a touch of the absurd. But hey, isn't that just politics as usual? The council meeting you're about to crash is a masterclass in medieval governance, or lack thereof. Now, let's set the scene. You're strolling into a makeshift town hall, probably a commandeered church or a roomy barn, medieval multi-use buildings at their finest. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of incense, a desperate attempt to mask the odor of too many unwashed bodies crammed into one space. The local officials, a ragtag assembly of merchants, minor nobles, and church figures, are seated in a rough circle. Picture a medieval version of a corporate boardroom, but with fewer PowerPoint slides and more divine invocations. The hot topic on today's docket: quarantine measures. Yes, even back in the 14th century, the idea of staying put to stop the spread of disease was floating around, albeit wrapped in a cloak of superstition and guesswork. Some cities, like Milan, took lockdowns to heart, sealing off houses where the plague had struck and posting guards to enforce the quarantine. Harsh, sure. Effective. Surprisingly, yes. Milan managed to keep its mortality rate significantly lower than other cities, proving that sometimes draconian measures can pay off. Now, while Milan was busy being the overachiever of the medieval world, other cities were more like the class clowns. Take Florence, for instance. They tried a more laissez-faire approach, with predictably disastrous results. The city saw upwards of 60% of its population wiped out. It's a reminder that even in the 14th century, governance styles could swing wildly from cautious to cavalier. And then there are the flagellants. Ah, the flagellants. Those infamous zealots who believed a good whipping would stave off the plague. They'd march through towns, self-flagellating with whips, singing hymns, and generally making a scene. It was part penitence, part performance art, and entirely ineffective against a disease that didn't care how much you punished yourself. Yet, in a world grasping for answers, their spectacle was strangely appealing. People flocked to watch, hoping for divine intervention, or, at the very least, a bit of theatrical entertainment to break the monotony of daily death. But let's not be too quick to judge. In a time when science was about as advanced as a medieval cookpot, people turned to what they knew: faith, rituals, and a good dose of spectacle. The authorities, however, weren't thrilled with these traveling flagellant circuses, fearing they spread more panic than piety. By 1349, the Catholic Church had had enough and banned the movement, though not before it had gained quite the following. It's a classic case of too little, too late, a theme you'll notice runs through much of history. Now, let's dive into the juicy part: misinformation. If you think fake news is a modern phenomenon, think again. During the plague years, rumors spread faster than the disease itself. Some folks blamed the planetary alignment, others pointed fingers at witches, and many, tragically, turned their ire on Jewish communities, accusing them of well poisoning. These baseless accusations led to horrific pogroms, showing that fear can twist perceptions, and humanity's darker instincts are never far from the surface. What's fascinating is how these medieval conspiracy theories mirror those of today. Swap out poison wells for 5G towers, and you've got yourself a timeless tale of scapegoating. It's as if the human brain has a preset switch that flips from logic to lunacy in times of crisis. So, next time you're shaking your head at the latest online conspiracy, take a moment to remember that this kind of thinking has deep, tangled roots. Back to our council meeting, where the debate has shifted to trade. With the plague decimating populations, the economy is taking a nosedive. Ports are closing faster than you can say, quarantine, and trade routes are as empty as a monk's wine cellar. Some cities, like Venice, are implementing strict maritime quarantines, holding ships at bay for 40 days before allowing them to dock, a practice that gives us the term quarantine from the Italian quarantagiorni, meaning 40 days. It's a smart move, but one that chokes the flow of goods and, by extension, prosperity. Meanwhile, our medieval leaders are wringing their hands over the economic impact, trying to balance public health with commerce. Sound familiar? It's a dilemma that echoes through the ages, and while today's solutions might involve more Zoom meetings and less incense, the core conflict remains unchanged. As the meeting winds down, you notice a weary resignation settling over the council members. They're grappling with a crisis that feels insurmountable, their decisions dictated as much by fear and guesswork as by sound strategy. It's a sobering reminder that leadership, then and now, is often a messy affair, full of missteps and miscalculations. Yet, despite the chaos, there's a certain resilience in their efforts, a determination to hold society together with whatever threadbare means available. As you step back into the evening air, the weight of the day's revelations settles over you. The political responses to the plague are as varied as the cities themselves, with each community charting its own course through the storm. And while some strategies are more successful than others, all are bound by a common thread: the struggle to adapt in the face of unprecedented calamity. So, as you trudge homeward, consider the parallels between then and now. The Black Death, for all its devastation, is a mirror reflecting human nature, our capacity for ingenuity and folly, for compassion and cruelty. And while the details may differ, the essence of our response to crisis remains remarkably consistent. It's a humbling realization, one that reminds us of our shared humanity across the centuries. In closing, as you make your way through this medieval landscape of uncertainty, take heart in the knowledge that history is a great teacher, offering lessons in resilience and adaptation. The world may be chaotic, but the human spirit is nothing if not resourceful. And who knows, perhaps, in the face of today's challenges, we can find inspiration in the past, forging a path forward with the wisdom of hindsight. But for now, it's time to rest and prepare for whatever tomorrow's council meeting might bring. As you retire for the evening, pondering the economic and political circus you've just witnessed, you can't shake the feeling that something more profound is bubbling beneath the surface. Sure, the plague is tearing through Europe like a particularly vindictive tornado, but it's also reshaping the very fabric of medieval society. And while these shifts might not make the evening news, if such a thing existed, they're every bit as impactful as the latest plague statistics. First up on the societal shake-up docket, the family. Now, in the 14th century, the family unit is the cornerstone of existence, for better or worse. It's a bit like a medieval sitcom, with roles clearly defined and everyone knowing their part. But when the plague rolls in, those neatly stacked dominoes start toppling. With so many family members succumbing to the disease, traditional roles are abandoned faster than a sinking ship. Take women, for instance. While typically relegated to domestic duties, many now find themselves thrust into new roles due to sheer necessity. Widows and daughters are stepping up to manage estates, run businesses, and make decisions previously reserved for the menfolk. It's a seismic shift in gender dynamics, albeit one born from tragedy. And while this newfound autonomy is empowering, it's also a heavy mantle to bear. After all, juggling household chores while negotiating trade deals wasn't exactly part of the medieval homemaker's manual. Then there's the community aspect. With families fractured, people begin relying on their neighbors more than ever. The village becomes an extended support network, a lifeline in dark times. Sure, some folks are still pointing fingers and sniffing around for scapegoats, but many are banding together, sharing resources, and forming bonds that transcend bloodlines. It's a heartwarming reminder that even in the direst of circumstances, humanity's capacity for cooperation and solidarity shines through. Another surprising consequence of the plague's societal upheaval: social mobility. Yes, you heard that right. The Black Death, for all its grim reaping, is inadvertently opening doors that were previously nailed shut. With so many dead, labor shortages create opportunities for those who survive. A peasant today, a landowner tomorrow. It's a tale that might sound like a medieval Cinderella story, minus the glass slipper and fairy godmother. Of course, this isn't a Cinderella story for everyone. Not everyone gets a magical socio-economic transformation, but for some lucky individuals, the plague is a brutal equalizer, leveling the playing field in ways no one could have anticipated. It's a bit like a lottery where the ticket price is survival, and the winnings are a chance at a better life. Now, let's move on to those infamous plague doctors. The mysterious figures in beaked masks and long robes, the stuff of legend, and let's face it, more than a few nightmares. In reality, these so-called doctors are about as medically qualified as your average medieval rat. The iconic costume, a long overcoat, gloves, and that eerie bird-like mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, is less about germ theory, which doesn't exist yet, and more about protecting the wearer from miasma, the bad air believed to cause disease. Most plague doctors are little more than opportunists, swooping in to offer dubious remedies at inflated prices. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of snake oil salesmen, only with a penchant for dramatically macabre fashion. Bloodletting, leeching, and potions made from who knows what are par for the course, and while their methods are largely ineffective, they do manage to capture the imagination and fear of the populace. As for how communities cope with the overwhelming loss and fear, well, it's a mixed bag. Religion, unsurprisingly, plays a huge role. With the Church's narrative of plague as divine punishment ringing in everyone's ears, people turn to prayer, penance, and pilgrimage in droves. Yet as faith is tested, so too is its counterpart, doubt. Some begin to question the Church's wisdom, sowing seeds of skepticism that will take centuries to fully sprout. And then there's humor. Yes, dark, gallows humor becomes a coping mechanism for many. It's the age-old human response to laugh in the face of adversity, to find some sliver of light amid the shadows. Plague-themed songs and poems start cropping up, providing a cathartic release even as they paint a grim picture of the times. It's a reminder that humor, even of the bleakest variety, is a universal balm for the soul. So, as you drift off to sleep, consider the strange alchemy of the plague. It's a crucible of change, melting down established norms and forging new realities. Families adapt, communities evolve, and society itself is reshaped in ways both subtle and profound. And while the path forward is fraught with uncertainty, there's a resilience at play, a testament to humanity's ability to endure, adapt, and ultimately survive. The night deepens, and as you surrender to the embrace of sleep, you can't help but feel a flicker of hope amid the chaos. For even as the world stands on the precipice of collapse, it's also poised for reinvention. Tomorrow, as the saga of the plague continues to unfold, there will be new stories to tell, new myths to debunk, and new lessons to learn. So rest well, for there's much more to uncover in this medieval tapestry of upheaval and transformation. As the plague-ridden night envelops Europe, we find ourselves pondering the long shadow cast by the Black Death. Sure, it's a grim reaper with a talent for societal upheaval, but it also sows the seeds for something monumental, the Renaissance. Yeah, that's right. The plague is like the unwitting midwife to one of history's most dazzling periods of intellectual rebirth. Who knew that a disease could be such a catalyst for change? Let's start with art, because nothing screams rebirth quite like a fresco or two. The Black Death gives artists a new palette, one tinged with existential dread and a fascination with mortality. Prior to the plague, medieval art was largely focused on religious themes, with figures that looked more like cardboard cutouts than real people. Then, bam, the plague hits, and suddenly there's a shift toward realism and human emotion. Artists start to capture the raw, unfiltered essence of life and death. It's like they collectively decided, hey, let's paint people who look like they have actual feelings. The result? Art that speaks to the human experience in all its gory glory. Take, for example, the Dance of Death, or Dance Macabre, a motif that crops up in paintings and manuscripts post-plague. It's a macabre conga line led by skeletons, reminding everyone that death doesn't discriminate. It's the ultimate equalizer. This motif becomes wildly popular, serving as both a memento mori and a grim reminder of recent events. It's art imitating life, or death, as it were, and it's resonating with a society that's been through the ringer. But it's not just art that gets a makeover. The plague also nudges Europe toward a cultural renaissance. With so many clergy members lost to the disease, the Church's iron grip on intellectual life begins to loosen. Scholars start to question long-held doctrines, and humanism gains ground. This new way of thinking emphasizes the value of human potential and experience over divine intervention. It's as if people collectively realize, hey, maybe we should focus on life here and now, rather than just the afterlife. Enter the Renaissance, an era of innovation, discovery, and dare we say, a bit of swagger. We're talking about a period that gives rise to figures like Leonardo da Vinci, who decides that painting, sculpting, and inventing aren't enough, so he throws anatomy and engineering into the mix. The Renaissance is the ultimate comeback story, fueled by a curiosity about the natural world and humanity's place within it. Thanks to the plague shaking things up, the focus shifts from the celestial to the terrestrial, laying the groundwork for modern science and philosophy. Then there's the economic transformation. Remember how we chatted about labor shortages putting workers in the driver's seat? Well, that shift doesn't just vanish when the plague does. Instead, it sets the stage for the decline of feudalism and the rise of a more market-driven economy. With serfs demanding better pay and conditions, the traditional feudal order starts to crumble like a poorly baked pie crust. This shift paves the way for capitalism, which, love it or hate it, becomes a defining feature of the modern world. Let's not overlook the role of religion in this transformation. The Church, once the unchallenged authority, finds itself under scrutiny. The sheer scale of the plague leads many to question whether the clergy really have all the answers. Some folks start looking for spiritual solace outside traditional institutions, planting the seeds for the Reformation. It's a classic case of questioning the status quo, and it's about to change the religious landscape forever. As we wrap up our day in the life of a plague-ridden medieval Europe, it's clear that the Black Death is more than just a catastrophic event. It's a crucible of change, reshaping art, culture, and society. It's a stark reminder of the human capacity for resilience and reinvention, even in the darkest of times. The plague strips life down to its essentials, forcing people to adapt, innovate, and ultimately thrive. In the grand tapestry of history, the Black Death is a potent thread, one that highlights the unpredictability of human existence. It's a testament to the fact that, while we may be at the mercy of forces beyond our control, we're also capable of monumental change. So as you drift off to sleep, ponder the legacy of this pivotal moment. It's a story of destruction and creation, despair and hope. It's a reminder that while the past may be a foreign country, its lessons are timeless, offering a mirror to our own struggles and triumphs. And as history marches on, it's worth remembering that the Black Death, for all its horror, leaves a legacy that shapes the world we know today. It's a reminder that from the ashes of calamity, new beginnings arise, an eternal cycle of death and rebirth that defines the human journey.